What do you get when you mix royal blood with bad decisions, political ambition, and an alarming number of wedding rings? 29 queens who married like it was a full-time job and ruled like the vows were optional. Some wed for power, some for survival, and a few just couldn't stop saying, "I do." In this 2-hour journey through scandal, strategy, and seriously questionable husband choices, we dive into the true stories of history's most relentlessly married monarchs. Because behind every crown, there's usually an X, or 3. Before we dive headfirst into the royal chaos, make sure you're subscribed to the channel, because let's be honest, no one else is telling you bedtime stories about queens with more X's than heirs. And while you're here, drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Midnight in Manchester? 3 a.m. in Manila? We want to know who else is awake for this matrimonial madness. Eleanor of Aquitaine. Eleanor of Aquitaine was the kind of woman who would read your diary, edit it for grammar, then publish it under her own name, and somehow you'd thank her for it. Born into more land than most kings could dream of, she married 2 of them just to stay entertained. First, she became Queen of France by marrying Louis VII, a man so pious he probably apologized to his wine before drinking it. It was a match made in heaven, assuming heaven had separate bedrooms and irreconcilable theological differences. Louis, bless his ascetic little heart, wanted a nun. Eleanor wanted a kingdom and a real conversation. After trudging with him on a crusade where she allegedly dressed in armor and possibly slept with her uncle, allegedly, we said, she came home with a tan and a raging case of marital disillusionment. Louis, meanwhile, came home with absolutely nothing except maybe a deep suspicion that his wife had more charisma than him and a better strategic mind, which, of course, she did. Their divorce was a holy mess, dressed in legal robes. Officially, the church annulled the marriage on grounds of consanguinity because apparently the fact that they were 4th cousins mattered more than the fact that Eleanor was clearly ready to set Paris on fire just for fun. 2 daughters and 0 sons later, Eleanor galloped away from the stifling Parisian court and straight into the arms of Henry Plantagenet, future Henry II of England, a man 12 years her junior, with more energy and fewer manners. This was not a rebound. This was an escalation. Henry and Eleanor were a political power couple with all the charm of a well-dressed earthquake. They had 8 children, most of whom would later go on to rebel against their father, sometimes at Eleanor's personal encouragement. Yes, she egged on her sons to overthrow their dad, because nothing says Mother of the Year like encouraging a civil war between Christmas dinners. Eleanor spent much of her second marriage in either active rebellion or comfortable imprisonment, depending on which decade you check in. Henry, naturally, had a few mistresses and a bit of a temper. Eleanor had ambition and a long memory. When Henry died, she emerged from captivity at the ripe age of 60-something and ran England like it was her personal vineyard. She lived to see 2 of her sons become kings, Richard the Lionheart and the less impressively nicknamed John, who got stuck with Lackland because medieval PR was brutal. Richard got himself kidnapped during the Crusades, and Eleanor, a septuagenarian at this point, personally rode across Europe to raise his ransom like a medieval Liam Neeson. John, on the other hand, tried to seize her lands while she was away. Spoiler, she outlived him, too. Eleanor died at 82, having outmaneuvered popes, outlived 2 kings, and outparented a royal bloodline that would later need Magna Carta just to behave. She was buried in Fontevraud Abbey next to both Henry and her favorite son, Richard, because even in death, Eleanor knew how to control the seating chart. She was a duchess in her own right, queen of 2 countries, and the closest thing the 12th century had to a rock star. But here's the twist. For all her political brilliance, literary patronage, and historical fame, her greatest legacy might just be how she turned royal marriage, a system designed to cage women into her personal chessboard, the queen who refused to be sidelined by either husband or history. And speaking of queens who refused to fade quietly into the background after one royal husband, the next one tried 2 royal brothers. And no, it didn't end well. Catherine of Aragon. Catherine of Aragon was born into fire, literally. The Spanish Inquisition was just getting warmed up when she entered the world in 1485, the youngest child of Ferdinand and Isabella, the Catholic monarchs who had a flair for conquest, colonization, and lighting things on fire in the name of God. As royal daughters go, Catherine was top shelf. Politically valuable, religiously devout, multilingual, and educated enough to lecture her tutors on Latin grammar. She was raised to believe she had divine purpose. Spoiler, so was every other royal. But Catherine actually behaved like she meant it. At just 3 years old, she was betrothed to Arthur, Prince of Wales. Because romance is much easier when you're both in diapers and the adults make all the decisions. At 16, she sailed to England with a trousseau heavy enough to bankrupt a mid-sized kingdom and married Arthur in a castle that probably smelled like wet stone and gout. They were young, they were awkward. They spent their honeymoon in Ludlow, which is the Tudor equivalent of being sent to a budget Airbnb to build chemistry. Arthur died 5 months later, which is either tragic or incredibly convenient depending on which side of Tudor history you read. Catherine insisted the marriage was never consummated. This would become the hill she chose to die on, metaphorically at first, then politically, spiritually, and almost literally. After Arthur's death, she was a teenage widow, stuck in a cold foreign country where the language was rough, the food was worse, and the political climate made Game of Thrones look like a group therapy session. Her parents still wanted her married into English royalty, and England still wanted her dowry. So everyone waited while Henry VII, Arthur's father, did math on the back of parchment to see if marrying her to his second son, also named Henry, would be worth the legal and theological mess. Eventually, it was decided. Young future Henry VIII would marry Catherine. But they waited, and waited, and waited. Henry VII wanted more dowry. Catherine lived in limbo, practically broke, negotiating through her priest while her father ghosted her on payments. Royal life was glamorous like that. Finally, in 1509, Henry VII died, and the new king now, Henry VIII, swept up Catherine and married her in a burst of chivalry, hormones, and political calculation. She was 23. He was 18. They were the Renaissance equivalent of a power couple on Instagram, golden-haired, athletic, pious, fertile-looking. For a moment, it worked. Catherine became Queen of England, and unlike many consorts before her, she reigned. She was deeply involved in governance, acted as regent during Henry's military campaigns, and even led the defense of England against the Scots while her husband was off playing war in France. When the Scottish king was killed in battle, Catherine sent Henry his bloody coat like it was a Valentine's gift. She played the part of the perfect wife and queen, educated, loyal, devout, endlessly dignified, which is, of course, exactly what made her so dangerous to Henry later. The problem was she kept giving birth to dead babies, or babies who died, or finally, one baby who lived merry. But Henry wanted a male heir, and his patience was thinner than his understanding of reproductive biology. By his early 32nd, he began cheating on her with escalating enthusiasm and theological creativity. Enter Anne Boleyn, and enter the Church of England. Stage left. When Henry decided he wanted an annulment, Catherine refused, repeatedly, passionately, publicly, because Catherine, bless her steel spine, believed her marriage was valid. She believed God had put her on England's throne. She believed, sincerely and stubbornly, that she was still Henry's wife, even as he set up his own church and literally married another woman. That level of denial would be sad if it weren't also so quietly magnificent. Her last years were spent in increasing isolation, physically separated from her daughter, stripped of her title, and hounded by Henry's bureaucrats. But she refused to acknowledge the annulment. She signed her letters, Queen Catherine, until the day she died. Her final message to Henry was an emotionally brutal farewell in which she forgave him and told him she still loved him, the man who erased her crown, her marriage, and her legacy. Catherine died in 1536, probably from cancer, certainly from heartbreak, definitely from a slow and grinding collapse of the world she had spent her life serving. She was buried quietly, without the honors due a queen, under a plaque that read, Princess Dowager. A reminder that power in royal hands is often just paperwork and perception. But history didn't forget her. She became a symbol of devotion, of dignity, of stubborn resistance. And while Henry went on to marry 5 more women and rewrite the national religion, it was Catherine who stayed unbending. In an empire of shape-shifting loyalties, she held one shape, queen. And yet, for all her rigidity, the next queen on our list was made of silk, not steel. She played the same game, but she smiled while doing it. And if you're still with us after Catherine of Aragon's marital misadventures, bless your insomnia or your historical curiosity, don't forget to subscribe. These royal rabbit holes only get deeper. While you're here, tell us in the comments. Where are you watching from and what time is it on your end? Because somewhere, someone's learning about Tudor divorce drama at 2 a.m. and we respect that. Anne of Brittany. Anne of Brittany spent her entire life being married off like a collectible chess piece, prized not for her feelings but for the land under her feet. The Duchy of Brittany was the crown jewel of medieval France's never-ending monopoly game, and Anne, born into its ducal line, was the 12-year-old girl who accidentally became the last independent ruler of it. From that moment on, every man in Europe with a spare title and a sword pointed in her direction. Brittany wasn't just a patch of land, it was leverage. And Anne knew it. At 13, she was already fielding marriage proposals like a noblewoman twice her age. Her first match was Maximilian I of Austria. Theoretically, a solid political alliance, except the marriage was conducted by proxy. Translation: she married a guy who wasn't even in the room. Romantic. Technically, she was the Holy Roman Empress. Practically, France was not amused. Charles VIII, the King of France, and a man whose forehead could double as a medieval billboard, decided he wanted Brittany for himself, so he laid siege to it, not metaphorically, literally, with armies. Because what says, "Will you marry me?" more sincerely than military invasion? Anne, realizing her options were be Queen of France or be Queen of Rubble, chose the former. She annulled her marriage to Maximilian, who, to be fair, had never shown up, and in 1491, she married Charles VIII, her captor-turned-husband in what history likes to call a political union and Anne probably called hostage negotiation with embroidery. She was forced to give up her crown as sovereign duchess, but she got to keep the title and all the passive-aggressive dignity that came with it. Charles wasn't a terrible husband, just short, sickly, and tragically incompetent. He banged his head on a low doorframe and died a few years into their marriage, leaving Anne a widow with several dead children and an entire kingdom's worth of diplomatic migraines. But Anne wasn't just sitting in her chamber sighing wistfully into lacework. She went straight back to Brittany, reasserted her authority, and put the duchy back under her personal control like a boss. But the French crown wasn't done with her. Enter Louis XII, Charles's cousin, successor, and a man who wanted Brittany just as badly, but with better tailoring. He already had a wife, though. Problem? Not really. He got the Pope to annul that marriage on the grounds of, "We're just really good friends," and then married Anne in 1499. This time, she negotiated harder. Brittany would remain separate from France unless their son inherited both. Spoiler, no such son survived, but Anne tried. She was now Queen of France again, which sounds romantic, until you realize it meant spending your life surrounded by bishops and lawyers drawing up contracts to decide what your uterus owed the state. Anne and Louis had 2 daughters who lived past infancy, Claude and Renee. Claude would go on to marry Francis I and help finally merge Brittany into the French crown for good, a process Anne had fought against with every decorative ribbon at her disposal. She wanted Brittany to stay separate, independent, hers, and when she realized it wouldn't, she doubled down on symbolism. Anne, dressed like a duchess, signed her letters with Brittany first and commissioned portraits that practically shouted, "I'm doing this under protest." She made royal pageantry her silent rebellion. Even in her second marriage, she kept showing up to official events in Breton black and silver, like a gothic ex-girlfriend who keeps attending her ex-husband's wedding anniversaries just to remind him of the prenup. When Anne died at age 37, her body was buried in the Basilica of Saint Denis like a queen, but her heart? She had it removed and sent back to Brittany in a gold-enameled reliquary shaped like a book, because Anne, ever the romantic, understood metaphor, and politics, and grief. Her heart literally belonged elsewhere. Anne's story isn't a love story, it's a land story. She was married twice to 2 kings by the iron grip of geopolitics, and both times she negotiated like someone who knew how the game worked. She didn't dream of rescue or romance. She dreamed of legal clauses, dowry clauses, succession laws, and the next battle of wills disguised as a wedding. Her life was a French court drama dressed in veils. And yet, for all her strategic endurance, Anne's story feels almost quaint compared to the queen who comes next, a woman who married 3 times, became a widow twice, and then had the audacity to start a civil war just because the 3rd one got boring. Mary, Queen of Scots. If you ever wondered what it would look like to watch a royal soap opera get rewritten by a Shakespearean tragedian with a taste for melodrama and daggers, meet Mary, Queen of Scots. Born with 3 crowns in her crib and enough Catholic symbolism to make Protestant England break into hives, Mary was royal from the womb. Queen of Scotland at 6 days old because her dad died of despair or dysentery. Sources differ. Mary was an infant monarch before she could sit upright. Scotland, naturally, rejoiced by immediately descending into the usual spiral of clan warfare, regencies, and religious confusion. But don't worry, that was just Act I. Act 2 took place in France. Mary was shipped there at 5, raised in a palace that smelled of incense and ambition, and married to the sickly Dauphin Francis at 16. He was delicate, physically frail, and terminally royal. Their marriage lasted about as long as your average Renaissance festival 18 months before Francis died, leaving Mary a teenage widow with a perfectly pressed black veil and absolutely no idea where to go next. France didn't want her anymore, Scotland barely remembered her, and England wanted her dead but hadn't figured out how to legally justify it. So back Mary went to her birthplace, stepping off the boat in Leith in 1561 like a vision out of a Catholic oil painting, tall, beautiful, fluent in 5 languages, and about to make the worst romantic decisions in recorded history. Scotland, of course, was now thoroughly Protestant. Her half-brother James Stuart was holding the reins, and John Knox, the human manifestation of a wet theological rag, was publicly calling her Jezebel for wearing mascara. Mary smiled through it. She was polite, diplomatic, and constitutionally incapable of staying single. Enter Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, a tall, vain, English-born cousin with a claim to the English throne, a drinking problem, and all the depth of a gilded pudding. Mary married him anyway, perhaps for politics, perhaps for lust, perhaps just to create the future James VI of Scotland. They made a pretty couple, if you didn't mind the shouting, the jealousy, or the way he casually murdered her private secretary, David Rizzio, in front of her while she was pregnant. Yes, that happened. Darnley, fueled by insecurity and probably wine, barged into Mary's chamber with a gang of nobles and stabbed Rizzio to death at her feet. This wasn't just domestic drama. This was a psychodrama with a crown on top. Mary, being a consummate professional and possibly possessed by the ghost of Eleanor of Aquitaine, forgave Darnley. Publicly, politically, privately. She was done. Which brings us to marriage number 3, James Hepburn, 4th Earl of Bothwell. A rugged, violent nobleman with the kind of face that belongs on a whiskey label and the charm of a kicked door, Bothwell was implicated in Darnley's murder. Mary denied his involvement, then married him, within weeks, after he allegedly kidnapped and raped her, or, as Bothwell's supporters claimed, persuaded her. Renaissance PR was a nightmare. The marriage was a scandal so grotesque, even the Scottish nobility balked, and they were not easily shocked. The Protestant lords turned on her, crowds rioted, her enemies gathered like a storm. Mary, Queen of Scots, whose life had been a balancing act of royal blood and romantic ruin, was finally out of moves. She was imprisoned and forced to abdicate in favor of her infant son, James VI. Bothwell fled to Denmark, went mad in a cell, and died chained to a pillar. Mary, meanwhile, fled to England seeking protection from her cousin Elizabeth I, which in hindsight is like asking a lion to babysit your pet gazelle. Elizabeth kept Mary in captivity for 19 years. 19. That's longer than most monarchs stayed alive. Mary embroidered, plotted, wrote letters, and ultimately got caught in one conspiracy too many. The Babington plot sealed her fate. She was convicted of treason against a country she didn't rule, by a queen she didn't serve, in a court that already had the executioner polishing his axe. In 1587, Mary was beheaded at Fotheringhay Castle. It took more than one stroke. Her small dog was found hiding in her skirts afterward, because apparently fate needed one final image to shove into your nightmares. Mary's life was a tangle of thrones, crowns, beds, and betrayals. She was the queen who couldn't stop marrying disaster, who mistook chaos for strategy, who wore her charisma like armor but left her judgment at the altar. 3 husbands, 1 dead by suspicious explosion, 1 possibly a kidnapper, 1 a teenage corpse, and through it all, she kept writing poetry. But if Mary married for drama, the next queen married for empires. Twice. And in the end, she ruled them both. Emma of Normandy. Emma of Normandy may not be the most famous queen in your high school textbooks, but that's mostly because they didn't want you to know medieval politics had a lead actress who changed husbands like kingdoms change hands. Twice a queen of England, once a queen of Denmark, and possibly the only woman in early medieval Europe who married two enemy kings without getting burned at the stake. Emma didn't just survive the Game of Thrones, she ghost-wrote the pilot. Let's start at the beginning. Normandy, early 11th century. Emma was born a duchess, but more importantly, she was born Norman, which meant she had Viking blood, an appetite for conquest, and a nose for political weather. She was sent to England as a diplomatic bride to King Ethelred, a man whose nickname, the Unready, says more about him than any historian ever could. Unready, in Old English, meant ill-advised. And Emma, very quickly, learned just how ill-advised her new husband truly was. Ethelred ruled with the confidence of a man who'd never read a map and the wisdom of a leaky bucket. His England was constantly under siege from Danish raiders, and his solution to this problem was to pay them off. Repeatedly, with national taxes, which meant that by the time Emma arrived in court, the Viking invaders were richer than the people they were invading. Emma was Norman, not stupid. She watched her husband fumble diplomacy like it was a live eel and quietly began preparing for the day she'd need an exit strategy. Emma gave Ethelred several children, including Edward the Confessor, yes, that Edward, but she was never just a womb in a crown. She was politically active, fiercely intelligent, and famously strategic. Her original name was changed to Ealfgifu to make her more palatable to the Anglo-Saxons. Imagine being so Norman that they had to rename you just so the locals didn't riot. That's Emma. And then Ethelred died. Not of war wounds, just of sheer historical timing. Which would have been fine, except that almost immediately afterward, the Danes invaded again, this time under King Canute, a man whose name sounds like a Norse sneeze, but who was, in fact, terrifyingly effective. And here's where Emma does what Emma always does. She adjusts. Canute conquers England. Emma marries him. Just marries him. The widow of his enemy. The mother of Edward the Confessor. She puts on a fresh crown and calmly steps into her second queenship like she's changing shoes. It wasn't love, it was leverage, and Canute knew it. Emma came with legitimacy, Anglo-Saxon roots, and the ability to speak to the nobility in the language of survival. With Canute, Emma had more children, including Harthacnut, who would later become king himself. But don't mistake her role here as merely maternal. She was queen consort, political advisor, and occasionally regent. While Canute divided his time between Denmark, Norway, and England like a very bloodthirsty commuter, Emma held the reins in his absence. She managed court affairs, mediated disputes, and negotiated loyalties. She wasn't his shadow. She was his anchor. When Canute died in 1035, things got messy again. Multiple claimants, rival heirs, and a whole lot of royal testosterone trying to fill the power vacuum. Emma's two sets of sons from Ethelred and Canute ended up squabbling over the throne like half-brothers at a dysfunctional family reunion with swords. Emma? She backed her second son, Harthacnut, who was ruling Denmark at the time. She even had her firstborn, Edward, exiled to Normandy when he became inconvenient. Parenting in the Middle Ages was a contact sport. But wait, it gets colder. While Harthacnut was preparing to reclaim the English throne, Emma's stepson Harold Harefoot seized it instead. He pushed her out of power, exiled her, and confiscated her lands. Emma, now widowed again, found herself out of favor and out of England. But she didn't curl up and die at a number. She plotted, she waited, she sharpened her Latin. Because in exile, Emma commissioned the encomium Emmae Reginae, a flattering historical narrative about herself. Think of it as a medieval PR campaign. Look how legitimate I am. Look how unworthy my enemies are. Look how totally not complicit I was in any political murders. The book painted her as the rightful queen, the noble mother, and the only adult in the room. It was propaganda. Yes, but elegantly done. Eventually, her son Harthacnut returned and restored her position. She was back again. Seated at court, navigating through courtship, betrayal, and civil unrest with the kind of poise that comes from watching at least 3 kingdoms try to implode. And in the end, when Edward the Confessor, yes, that exiled son, took the throne in 1042, Emma was still around, a bit diminished, less politically powerful, but still present, still in the game. The mother of a sainted king, the widow of 2 monarchs, the survivor of every regime shift of her century. Emma of Normandy didn't just marry 2 kings, she made herself necessary to both. She played long games, sacrificed sons for thrones, and outlived every man who tried to write her out of the story. And if she ever shed a tear, it was probably in Latin, on vellum, with a notary present. But where Emma mastered survival through diplomacy and adaptation, the next queen chose a very different route, marrying her way into 3 power structures, across 2 kingdoms and a war zone, and somehow walking out of it all with a title and a legend. Judith of Flanders. If medieval Europe had a reality show titled Who Wants to Marry a Queen Regent?, Judith of Flanders would have been its breakout star, witty, elegant, and somehow always back on the throne even after everyone thought the season had ended. She wasn't just a queen. She was 3-time royalty, twice over in the same kingdom, and one of the rare women in early medieval history who managed to outmaneuver scandal, survive court politics, and live to commission art about it. Let's be clear, Judith was not meant to be a queen. She was born around 844, the daughter of Charles the Bald, King of West Francia, and granddaughter of Charlemagne himself. That meant she came from the sort of genetic stock where names were long, noses were longer, and your inheritance was measured in cathedrals. But she was never expected to rule. She was just supposed to get married and behave. You know, the usual 9th century female career track. Marry a foreign prince, produce heirs, die quietly of plague or childbirth, preferably off-screen. But Judith was not that kind of medieval accessory. Her first marriage came early and grand. She was wed to Ethelwulf, King of Wessex. That's England, before England was England. Ethelwulf was significantly older, possibly in his 50s, and had a full adult son from a previous marriage. Judith was around 12 or 13. By all available accounts, she didn't protest probably, because one does not protest when one is 13 and marrying a bearded warlord. Now here's where things get weird, even by royal standards. Judith was crowned queen, anointed with oil, in a public ceremony. This was not normal in Anglo-Saxon England. Queens weren't usually crowned. They were expected to sit down, shut up, and produce male heirs. But Judith, probably due to her Frankish royal lineage and her father's insistence, was given full ceremonial status. She didn't just marry into Wessex, she walked in with holy authority dripping off her robes. Ethelwulf died only 2 years later. No children, no dramatic betrayals, just a sudden royal vacancy. And this is where Judith absolutely swerves the narrative. Instead of going home to Francia like a discarded chess piece, Judith did something utterly unthinkable. She married her stepson, Ethelbald. That's right, her first husband's son. Historians are still sweating over whether this was consensual, coerced, strategic, scandalous, or all of the above. The church had a collective nosebleed. Marrying your stepmother, after all, wasn't exactly endorsed in the New Testament. But they did it. Married. Publicly. No shame. And once again, Judith remained queen. Ethelbald was younger, more energetic, and considerably more controversial. His reign was brief, about 3 years, and once again, Judith outlived him. Twice a Queen of Wessex, both times widowed, still childless, and somehow still politically viable. Most medieval women at this point would have been sent to a nunnery to live out their days praying for forgiveness and modestly aging out of public life. Not Judith. Instead, she went back to Francia, where she immediately turned heads again, this time not because she was scandalous, but because she was available. And who snapped her up? Baldwin I of Flanders. Not a king, not even a royal, just a count, with ambition, charisma, and the nerve to elope with a twice-widowed, royally anointed queen. Judith and Baldwin ran off together like teenagers from 2 different Netflix series. Charles the Bald, her dad, was absolutely livid. He declared the marriage invalid, raged at the church, and possibly tried to have them hunted down. But Judith, by now a veteran of royal politics, knew how to play her father. She negotiated. She pleaded. She waited. Eventually, the Pope got involved because, of course, he did, and Judith's marriage to Baldwin was legitimized. Her third husband might not have been a king, but he would become the first Count of Flanders, founding a dynasty that would rule for centuries. Together, Judith and Baldwin became a formidable duo, patronizing monasteries, building cities, and forging a territory that would one day become one of the most politically significant in Europe. And, perhaps more importantly, Judith finally had children. Sons who would carry her bloodline, daughters who would marry into European courts, and a legacy that would stretch far beyond the borders of any one crown. By the time she died, sometime in the 872nd, Judith had worn the crown of Wessex twice, dodged ecclesiastical condemnation, rebranded herself as a countess, and helped give birth to one of medieval Europe's most enduring noble houses. Not bad for a girl who was supposed to disappear after her first widowhood. She's rarely given credit in mainstream histories. But Judith of Flanders knew how to bend power toward herself without breaking under it. She wasn't a warrior. She didn't lead armies. She didn't write theological treatises or govern entire empires. She simply lived, survived, married strategically, and outlived her infamy. 3 husbands, 2 kingdoms, 1 legacy. And if Judith mastered the art of sidestepping the church's wrath, the next queen stared it down, married 4 times, including to the king who nearly beheaded her, and walked straight into the Reformation like she had dinner reservations with fate. Catherine Parr. Catherine Parr was not the sexiest of Henry VIII's wives. That dubious honor usually goes to the one who got executed for looking at a lute player the wrong way. Nor was she the tragic one, or the saintly one, or the one who somehow managed to birth a sickly heir and still die of childbirth. No, Catherine Parr was the last one, the final wife, the survivor, the one who walked into a royal marriage with her eyes wide open and a detailed escape plan embroidered into her underskirts. Let's be clear. By the time Henry proposed to her in 1543, Catherine had already been married twice. Once to a distant cousin, Edward Berg, a man so mild and short-lived he might as well have been a placeholder husband, and then to John Neville, 3rd Baron Latimer, who was older, Catholic, and frequently surrounded by people trying to burn things down during the Northern Rebellion. She had been a dutiful wife both times, which in Tudor England meant smiling politely while men decided your fate and hoping no one mistook your piety for sedition. By 31, Catherine was a twice-widowed noblewoman with no children, a sizable pension, and a decent library. She could have retired gracefully into comfortable widowhood, maybe opened a convent-themed book club, and avoided the suspiciously axe-shaped shadows cast by Henry VIII's marital history. But no. She had the bad luck or gall, depending on how you read it, to catch the king's eye. Henry at this point was less handsome warrior king and more wheezing gout-ridden tyrant in velvet. He was obese, paranoid, possibly infected with syphilis, and known for decapitating wives the way most people prune hedges. He had already cycled through 5 spouses. 2 were dead, 2 were divorced. 1 was buried in a shallow grave somewhere between scandal and tragedy. The idea that anyone would voluntarily marry him in 1543 is either testament to Catherine's bravery, her ambition, or her deep-seated martyr complex. And yet, she said yes. But here's the twist. Catherine wasn't in love with Henry. She was in love with Thomas Seymour, the rakish, opportunistic younger brother of Henry's 3rd wife, Jane. He was handsome, charming, dangerous in the way that only men who think with their cheekbones usually are. She wanted to marry him. She almost did, until the king intervened. And then suddenly she was wearing Tudor white, saying vows in front of a bishop, and wondering if it was too late to fake a coma. Once married, Catherine did what she'd always done. She adapted. She became the perfect queen consort. Educated, thoughtful, religious, without being inflammatory, politically savvy, and somehow capable of managing Henry's volatile moods without getting arrested or poisoned. She took care of his 3 children, Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward, like they were her own, and she restored Princess Mary to the royal succession, which is quite a feat when your stepdaughter is older than you and hates everyone. She even learned how to hide in plain sight, which was really the only way to survive in the Tudor court. But she wasn't just a glorified nursemaid. Catherine Parr was a published author, the first woman to publish a book in England under her own name in English. She wrote on faith, conscience, and reform. She wasn't radical, but she was definitely Protestant, which meant that in the paranoid fog of Henry's last years, she was always one sermon away from getting dragged to the Tower. In fact, she almost did. A group of Catholic courtiers plotted against her, convincing Henry she was too bold, too clever, too theologically independent. A warrant was drawn up. Her arrest was imminent. So what did Catherine do? She played sick, waited for the king's gout to flare, then waddled into his room, apologized for being an ignorant woman, and told him she only discussed scripture to distract him from his pain. Henry, predictably, believed her. He canceled the arrest and reportedly kissed her in bed that same night. If that's not survival instinct at its highest form, nothing is. Catherine outlived Henry by a year and a half, which, in Tudor marriage math, is the equivalent of outliving a serial killer. She married Thomas Seymour less than 4 months after Henry's death. Finally, the man she loved. She thought it was the happy ending. It was not. Thomas, as it turned out, was just as reckless and self-serving as everyone warned. He flirted with the teenage Princess Elizabeth, yes, his own stepdaughter, and was caught by Catherine in what might be the earliest recorded case of royal grooming. She tried to laugh it off. She even encouraged Elizabeth to leave the house. But the betrayal festered. And then she got pregnant. Finally, after 3 marriages and more patience than sainthood requires, Catherine became a mother. But the joy was short-lived. She died of puerperal fever in 1548, just 6 days after giving birth to her only child. Thomas lasted about a year longer before being executed for treason, leaving their daughter orphaned and quickly forgotten by history. So Catherine Parr, the final wife, ended not in peace but in irony. A queen who survived Henry VIII but not childbirth. A reformer who outwitted court intrigue, only to fall for a man who couldn't keep his hands to himself. A woman who published devotional literature about obedience while quietly manipulating the most dangerous man in England. And while Catherine navigated Tudor landmines with a book in one hand and a prayer in the other, our next queen will take that quiet, courtly survival instinct and toss it out the window because her marriages, much like her government, were held together with revolts, bullets, and pure constitutional chaos. Maria Christina of the Two Sicilies. Maria Christina of the Two Sicilies didn't just marry for love or politics, she married for control. And when that wasn't enough, she married again, then ran a country, then married again, this time secretly. Because when you're queen regent of a collapsing empire, you don't let something like scandal or laws get in the way of your romantic to-do list. Let's begin at the royal mess. Early 19th century Spain, a kingdom perpetually trying to figure out whether it was a feudal monarchy, a modern constitutional experiment, or just a historical punchline in powdered wigs. Into this unstable cocktail walked Maria Christina, a princess of Naples and Sicily, raised in the Bourbon court like a porcelain doll, but one that could survive a fall. At 23, she was married off to her much older uncle. No, that's not a typo. She married her uncle, King Ferdinand VII of Spain. The man was twice her age, perpetually ill, and politically desperate for a male heir. He'd already burned through 3 wives without producing a living child, and his royal advisors were getting anxious. Spain's succession laws at the time were like a broken family tree. If there was no male heir, the throne would pass to Ferdinand's brother Carlos, who was the human equivalent of a civil war waiting to happen. So Ferdinand married his niece, because if history has taught us anything, it's that genetic diversity was not high on Europe's royal priority list. And guess what? Maria Christina delivered. She gave birth to 2 daughters in quick succession. The elder was Isabella, future Queen of Spain. Problem was, Ferdinand died in 1833, leaving baby Isabella as the designated heir, which enraged Uncle Carlos, also her great-uncle, because again, royal gene pools are more like puddles. Carlos decided to declare himself king, claiming that the Salic law barred women from the throne, and just like that, Spain was in civil war. Maria Christina, suddenly widowed and 27, became Queen Regent of Spain for her toddler daughter, which meant that overnight she went from ornamental wife to de facto ruler of a country tearing itself in half. Imagine trying to potty train your child and fight a war against a furious uncle at the same time. That's regency in the 19th century. She allied herself with liberals not because she particularly liked liberalism, but because she hated Carlism more. Carlism was monarchist, ultra-conservative, and deeply patriarchal. Maria Christina wasn't about to hand over her crown to a man whose entire political platform was basically no girls allowed. So she struck a deal with the moderates, promised constitutional reform, and branded herself as the guardian of the future Queen Isabella II. But here's where the story swerves into melodrama. While she was defending the regency, dodging assassination attempts, and navigating a 3-way chess match between liberals, absolutists, and the church, Maria Christina had a secret. His name was Agustin Fernando Muñoz. He was a royal guard, tall, handsome. Definitely not a noble, definitely not approved by the Spanish court. But Maria Christina, now technically a dowager queen, married him, in secret, in 1833, barely a few months after her husband's death. That's right, the Queen Regent married her bodyguard in a morganatic marriage, meaning he got the wife but not the throne. She kept it hidden from everyone, including most of her allies, for years. She had 8 children with him, while technically ruling the country, while also fighting a civil war, while pretending to be celibate and grieving. This was less a love story and more a logistical miracle. Eventually, the truth leaked. The court was scandalized. The liberals began to question her loyalty. The conservatives never liked her anyway, and by 1840, her political balancing act crumbled. She was forced to resign the regency and go into exile in France, leaving behind a Spain that was still reeling from her choices. But exile didn't mean irrelevance. Maria Christina lived out her years as a royal socialite in Paris, managing her enormous family, manipulating dynastic marriages, and keeping one eye on Spanish politics like a cat watching a mouse hole. Her daughter Isabella eventually became queen in her own right, though not without considerable instability because Maria Christina's ghost never really left the Spanish court. And Muñoz? The humble guard? He got a pile of titles, some palaces, and the satisfaction of knowing he'd done what most courtiers only fantasized about, seduced the queen, and kept his head. In the end, Maria Christina's life reads like a romantic novel written by a constitutional lawyer, illicit marriage, legal loopholes, royal scandal, and civil war, all balanced on the satin-covered shoulders of one indomitable woman. She didn't just survive monarchy, she bent it until it looked like freedom. But if Maria Christina's rebellions were soft and hidden behind lace fans and secret weddings, the queen who comes next preferred her power with a sharp edge, literally. She married 3 kings, murdered her enemies, and helped invent a dynasty. And she did it all in a dress that probably had blood on the hem. Arsinoe II wasn't just a queen, she was a walking contradiction wrapped in gold, wearing a crown that doubled as political propaganda. She was the kind of woman who could marry her brother, her enemy, and her kingdom all in one lifetime, and still have room for an imperial cult in her honor. A Greek-born Egyptian queen who married 3 times, ruled over 2 empires, and managed to become a goddess before she died. She didn't just survive Hellenistic politics. She ascended above it, preferably on a gold chariot pulled by rumors. Born around 316 BCE into the Macedonian royal house, the Ptolemies. For those of you keeping score, Arsinoe was daughter to Ptolemy I, one of Alexander the Great's most talented generals. This was a family where ambition was inherited like eye color. Her brothers would become kings, her sisters pawns, and she became the wild card. Her first marriage was to Lysimachus, king of Thrace. He was an old war buddy of her father's, so naturally, he was about 3 decades older. Standard ancient world matchmaking logic. She was still a teenager. He was pushing 60, but Lysimachus was rich, powerful, and sitting on a chunk of Alexander's leftover empire, and Arsinoe played the role of young queen like a woman twice her age. She gave him sons, whispered in his ear, and got very good at identifying which courtiers needed to be bribed and which needed to be fed to the wolves. But then she made her first critical mistake. She tried to keep the crown for her children. In a move that would make any palace intrigue series blush, she accused her stepson Agathocles, Lysimachus's eldest and heir apparent, of plotting against his father. Lysimachus, not exactly a Dad of the Year candidate, had Agathocles executed. This sparked a political revolt. Suddenly, the other Hellenistic kings, who had been politely waiting for Lysimachus to die of old age, smelled blood in the water. One of them was Ptolemy Keranos, Arsinoe's half-brother, the kind of man who'd stab you in the back and then blame the knife for being too sharp. After Lysimachus was killed in battle, Arsinoe tried to hold on to her Thracian kingdom by marrying Keranos. Yes, that's correct. She married the man who helped orchestrate her husband's death. And yes, he was her brother. Not even her full brother, just enough for it to feel uncomfortable in both family trees and dynastic politics. To say it didn't go well would be generous. Arsinoe, likely suspecting she could manipulate Keranos, got played instead. He seized the throne, murdered her 2 younger sons, and she barely escaped with her life and her remaining child. Picture this. The queen who once ruled Thrace, now fleeing through the countryside in royal robes stained with betrayal and possibly blood. She made it to Egypt, her original homeland, battered but not broken. And this is where the plot shifts from tragedy to pure dynastic spectacle. Because in Egypt, her younger full brother, Ptolemy II, was king and unmarried. And in one of the boldest political rebrands in ancient history, Arsinoe married him. Yes, her full brother. Egyptian pharaonic tradition encouraged sibling marriages, something about divine lineage and Osiris, Isis cosplay, and the Greeks, while vaguely horrified tolerated it because Egypt printed money. They branded the union as divine. She became Arsinoe Philadelphus, Arsinoe sibling loving, which was less of a nickname and more of a public relations grenade. But it worked. Together, Arsinoe and Ptolemy II created a co-rule that was both real and symbolic. She appeared on coins. She was celebrated in temples. She led military campaigns. She introduced laws. She likely advised on trade and governance. She was queen not in name only, but in statecraft and ceremony. And when she died around 270 BCE, her brother-husband declared her a goddess. Not posthumously, immediately. She became part of the dynastic cult, worshipped alongside Egyptian deities, prayed to by people who had no idea she once married the man who killed her kids. Arsinoe II managed to turn tragedy into elevation, sibling incest into state policy, and her own image into divine iconography. Her face adorned coins across the Mediterranean. Her temples stood in cities far beyond Egypt. She outshone every other woman in the Ptolemaic line, including Cleopatra, who would later model herself on Arsinoe's legacy. The difference? Cleopatra died on a boat with a snake. Arsinoe died in her palace, crowned a goddess. And maybe that's the real mystery of Arsinoe II, not that she married 3 men, but that she used each marriage as a rung on the political ladder. She loved power more than any husband. She didn't mourn. She moved. She reinvented herself from refugee widow to ruling queen to eternal deity. And when her cult spread across the empire, it wasn't just propaganda. It was victory. But while Arsinoe weaponized dynasty to become divine, the queen who comes next started with divinity and descended into chaos. Her first marriage was a diplomatic power grab, her second ended with a royal execution, and her third was with a man nicknamed the Handsome, who she might have had murdered. So, in many ways, we're just getting started. Berenice II. If Arsinoe II ruled like a goddess, Berenice II ruled like a thunderstorm. She wasn't a queen who stood quietly next to the throne. She was the storm system behind it, the lightning strike between marriages, and the knife that may or may not have ended her first husband. Born in the 3rd century BCE in the glittering, deadly court of Cyrene, an ancient Greek kingdom in North Africa, Berenice grew up with power braided into her curls and ambition sharpened at the dinner table. Her mother, Apama II, was a Ptolemaic princess. Her father, King Magas of Cyrene, was a breakaway ruler who spent most of his reign thumbing his nose at Egypt and quietly building a rival dynasty. When he died, Berenice inherited not only a throne but a problem. She was a young woman, alone in a kingdom, surrounded by men with swords and entitlement issues. The solution? Marriage. The problem? To whom? Initially, her mother arranged a dynastic match with Demetrius the Fair. A Macedonian prince, Demetrius was good-looking, well-connected, and fatally charming. His nickname wasn't ironic. He was literally called the Fair, as in the pretty one. Berenice married him, presumably under the usual protocol of political pressure, maternal plotting, and reluctant acceptance. But this wasn't a slow burn romance. This was a scandal scripted by the gods. Because, shortly after marrying Berenice, Demetrius began sleeping with her mother. Yes, her mother. Apama, still politically hungry and maybe just bored, decided to seduce her daughter's husband. In what might be the most dysfunctional royal triangle since Oedipus's family reunion, the palace filled with whispers, and Berenice who, by all accounts, was not the type to cry into her embroidery, responded, the only way she knew how, decisively, violently, and with a dagger. Historical records are fuzzy, but most agree Berenice had Demetrius assassinated. Some sources claim she did it herself, others suggest loyal courtiers handled the details, but either way, he ended up dead. And not in the soft, royal, he died of a mysterious illness way, in the he slept with the wrong woman and was promptly eliminated way. Royal gossip, of course, tried to frame it as a tragedy. But in truth, it was a power play. Berenice wasn't just eliminating a cheating husband, she was reclaiming her sovereignty. So now Berenice was widowed, scandal-tainted, and sitting on a throne in Cyrene. The Ptolemies in Egypt were watching carefully, and they saw an opportunity. Ptolemy III Euergetes, the benefactor, was the third ruler in Egypt's Greek dynasty. He had ambition, military swagger, and a convenient family tree that matched Berenice's. A marriage between them would reunite Cyrene with Egypt, solidify power across North Africa, and possibly prevent more scandalous homicides at family gatherings. So they married. And this time, the match stuck. This wasn't a quiet domestic partnership. Ptolemy and Berenice ruled together, and she wasn't just a consort handing out olive wreaths. She was listed in royal decrees, appeared on coins, attended council meetings. She was actively co-ruling Egypt during one of its most aggressive and expansionist periods. While Ptolemy launched military campaigns that stretched into Syria and Mesopotamia, Berenice managed affairs at home, often with more efficiency than her husband. And she had her own mythology. Most famously, she supposedly vowed to sacrifice her hair to the gods if Ptolemy returned safely from war. He did. She cut her hair and placed it in a temple. The next day, the hair was gone, vanished. Astronomers, either desperate to avoid divine punishment or high on poetic license, claimed the gods had placed her curls in the sky. Thus was born the constellation Coma Berenice's hair. She literally became a star. But of course, stars fade. And political storms don't last forever. After Ptolemy's death, their son Ptolemy IV took the throne. He was everything his parents weren't: weak, indulgent, and manipulable. One of his first acts, executing his own mother, Berenice II, no grand funeral, no divine honors, just an efficient purge. Because even as a widow in her 50s, Berenice was too dangerous for a puppet king to tolerate. So she died, not in battle, not in old age, but as collateral damage in her son's insecure little reign. After a lifetime of surviving husbands, scheming mothers, and dynastic politics, it was her own blood that ended her. Yet Berenice wasn't forgotten. She stayed in the sky. Her constellation remained. And so did her legend. The queen who turned her rage into strategy, her grief into governance, and her bad marriages into empires. One husband dead by scandal, one erased by conquest, and one her son who learned that even in death, a mother like Berenice doesn't let you sleep easy. But if Berenice ruled through blood and rebellion, the next queen took a different route entirely, one that led not through royal succession, but through a battlefield, a coup, and a bathtub full of daggers. She married 2 sultans, took the throne herself and ruled not just as a consort, but as a sovereign. Until, of course, her own story ended the way all dangerous ones do, in betrayal, blades, and silence. Shajar al-Durr. Shajar al-Durr didn't inherit her throne. She seized it from blood, smoke, and silk-swathed subterfuge. A woman of unknown origin, unknown birth date, and an ending that still feels like a cautionary tale whispered through centuries of palace walls. She wasn't born royal, but she became it. Not through accident or romance, but through audacity and steel nerves disguised under layers of ivory and incense. She was a concubine, a wife, a sultana, a widow, a ruler, and finally, ironically, tragically, a martyr to the very power she dared to wield. Her name means Tree of Pearls, but her rise was more like a lightning strike than a slow bloom. We begin in the crumbling days of the Ayyubid dynasty, somewhere in the early 13th century. The Crusades were still grinding on like a rusted wheel of blood and piety. Egypt was the glittering prize in a region cracking under pressure from both within and without. Shajar al-Durr entered the scene not with trumpets or titles, but as a slave, an enslaved Turkic woman brought into the harem of As-Salih Ayyub, the Sultan of Egypt. Now, normally, that would be the end of her story. Concubine becomes mother, retires quietly, dies forgotten. But Shajar wasn't designed for sidelines. She became Ayyub's favorite, his companion, his strategist, eventually his wife, an elevation rare enough for historians to pause and raise an eyebrow. And when the Sultan fell ill during the Seventh Crusade, led by Louis IX of France, Shajar stepped into power not as a widow, but as a queen-in-waiting. Then Ayyub died, which should have been the end for her. But Shajar refused to let the story close. In one of the most audacious moves in medieval Islamic history, she hid the Sultan's death for weeks, maybe months. She kept his death secret from the court, the army, and even from many of his advisors. She claimed he was indisposed, issued orders in his name, even forged his signature, allegedly. Because she knew if the Crusaders learned Egypt's ruler was dead, they'd pounce. The kingdom would fall. So she sat on the throne behind a veil and spoke through ghost-written decrees. It worked. She coordinated the defense of Egypt. Her armies, under the command of Mamluk generals, enslaved soldiers turned elite warriors, crushed the Crusaders. Louis IX was captured. The tide turned. And only then did she announce Ayyub's death. Because now, she wasn't just the dead Sultan's wife. She was the woman who saved Egypt. And so, for a brief, shining moment in 1250, Shajar al-Durr ruled Egypt as its sole monarch. Not a regent, not a placeholder, not a puppet. Sultana. Coins were minted in her name. Sermons delivered in mosques praised her. She signed documents, led councils, and sat in state while diplomats fumbled over what to call her. It was the first time since Cleopatra that a woman ruled Egypt in her own right, and this time it wasn't via inheritance. It was through force, calculation, and absolutely unapologetic ambition. But history, particularly the male-dominated kind, doesn't like when women win. The Caliph in Baghdad, horrified at the idea of a woman ruling a Muslim state, sent a letter dripping with theological condescension. Egypt's religious leaders began whispering about legitimacy. The Mamluk generals, once her allies, now saw opportunity, and Shajar, brilliant though she was, saw what was coming. So she did what every cornered queen does. She married again. This time, it was to Aybak, a Mamluk commander, ambitious, rough-hewn, and politically useful. She hoped to maintain her grip on power by ruling through him. He hoped to become king in truth, Not just in name. For a while, it worked. But then Aibak began meeting with other nobles, making deals, considering a new wife this time a daughter of a rival sultan, a more traditional match, a more obedient bride. So Shajar had him murdered. Maybe she ordered it, maybe her loyal retainers acted first. Either way, Aibak was found dead in his bath. A sultana's message written in blood and bathwater. It was bold. It was brutal. It was her final move, because the backlash came swift and feral. The Mamluks turned on her. The court erupted. Aibak's teenage son, Al-Mansur Ali, was declared sultan, and Shajar was dragged from the palace by palace, women and concubines loyal to Aibak's faction, beaten, tortured, and ultimately killed with wooden clogs. Not swords, not poison, clogs. The weapons of servants. The irony was biblical. Her body was tossed from the citadel wall, unburied for days, a silent warning to every woman who dared to rule like a man. And yet, her legacy lingered. The Mamluks, emboldened by the political machinery she helped build, soon overthrew the Ayyubids entirely and founded their own dynasty. Egypt entered a new era of military rule. But it was Shajar who lit the match, who carved space in history, not as someone's wife, not as someone's mother, but as a woman who looked at a collapsing kingdom and said, "Number mine." And while her end was brutal, her rise was seismic. A slave who became queen, a widow who became a ruler, a consort who dared to wield sovereign power, not quietly, not kindly, but completely. The next queen on our journey? She also married twice. Her first husband left her a widow. Her second made her empress of one of the richest empires in the world. And unlike Shajar, she didn't die for her ambition. She thrived in it, draped in silk, holding the emperor in the palm of her perfumed hand. Nur Jahan. Nur Jahan didn't just marry an emperor, she rewrote the definition of what it meant to be a queen in the Mughal Empire. She was not born into power, not raised in palaces, and certainly not destined to rule. But she did anyway. Because when the empire's strongest man fell in love with her, he didn't just get a wife, he got a co-ruler, an equal, a strategist, with velvet gloves and iron intentions. A woman who turned a palace into a command center and the imperial harem into her personal court of ministers. Let's start with her first husband, because of course she had one before she became the most powerful woman in the Mughal dynasty. Nur Jahan was born as Mer Unnisa in 1577 to Persian nobility living in exile in India. Her family, respectable but not especially powerful, found employment in the court of Emperor Akbar, one of the most influential emperors in Indian history. As was custom for women of noble but non-royal birth, Mer Unnisa was married young. Her first husband was Sher Afghan Khan, a Mughal military officer stationed in Bengal, with all the ambition and social capital of a man who knew how to swing a sword but not a conversation. By all accounts, it was a functional marriage, though not an especially happy one. Sher Afghan was competent, distant, and possibly politically suspect. He died under mysterious circumstances during a skirmish with the Mughal governor of Bengal. Some whispered that the governor had been ordered to eliminate him. Others believe Sher Afghan got himself killed by being arrogant at the wrong time. What we know is this. Mer Unnisa, now a widow with a daughter, was taken into the imperial court. That should have been the end of her story. But no. She didn't fade into the embroidered wallpaper like a proper grieving widow. She became a lady-in-waiting to the emperor's stepmother and caught the eye of Emperor Jahangir himself. And once Jahangir saw her, that was it. Game over. Jahangir was a ruler with a taste for opium, art, and women with sharp minds. Berenice didn't just captivate him, she changed him. They married in 1611, and she took the name Nur Jahan, Light of the World. It wasn't just a romantic title, it was a political reality. Nur Jahan wasn't content with embroidery and poetry readings. She stepped into governance like she'd been born with a crown. She issued imperial orders, farmhands bearing her seal. She minted coins in her name. Coins in her name. That's not symbolic power. That's actual legal economic sovereignty. While Jahangir increasingly retreated into a haze of wine and opiates, Nur Jahan stepped in not as a regent, not as a whispering consort behind a screen, but as the visible, functioning head of state. She managed foreign policy, negotiated alliances, handled court appointments, selected military generals. She led royal hunts on horseback with a musket strapped to her saddle. She wasn't merely breaking gender norms, she was riding over them at full gallop. And the court? They tolerated her because they had to. Even her enemies admitted she was terrifyingly competent. Her family, the so-called Nur Jahan junta, rose in power as she orchestrated a network of influence. Her brother became the chief advisor. Her father served as prime minister. Her niece married Jahangir's son. Every thread of the Mughal court slowly twisted toward her hand. But empires don't like women who get too good at ruling. As Jahangir's health declined, succession became the new battlefield. Nur Jahan backed her son-in-law Shajar for the throne. Unfortunately for her, the better politician and far superior military tactician was Prince Khurram, better known to history as Shah Jahan. You might recognize him as the guy who built the Taj Mahal, but before he became an architectural romantic, he was a sharp-edged contender for imperial power, and Nur Jahan stood in his way. When Jahangir died in 1627, Nur Jahan's political house of cards collapsed overnight. Shah Jahan seized the throne. Shahryar was executed. Her family was purged from court. And Nur Jahan, once the empress who governed an empire, was exiled into a quiet, gilded retirement. But let's be honest, no retirement is truly quiet when you're Nur Jahan. She lived out her final years in Lahore, commissioning gardens, buildings, and poetry. She dressed in white, the color of mourning, but never in defeat. She became a patron of the arts, her name still whispered in the corridors of power. Even stripped of political title, her presence was a ghost over the Mughal court, unavoidable, unforgotten. She died in 1645, aged nearly 70. Her tomb, modest compared to the mausoleum she inspired, still stands. No towering domes, no marble spires. Just an inscription that reads, "This is the resting place of the Queen, Nur Jahan, but don't let the humility fool you. She may have ended in exile, but for 17 years, she ruled the richest empire in the world with ink, coin, sword, and whisper. No woman before or after her wielded such total control in the Mughal Empire. And yet just when you think you've seen the limits of royal reinvention, the next queen makes her entrance. She wasn't a regent. She was a child. An empress in name at the age of 6, dethroned by age 8, and married off to a man who helped erase her legacy. But the strangest part? She's still remembered as the last legitimate ruler of a fallen dynasty, Chieu Hoang. Chieu Hoang came into power not with a crown placed on her head, but with a crown pressed onto her small, uncertain shoulders because she was 6. That's not metaphor. That's not literary exaggeration. She was 6 years old when she became Empress Regnant of Dai Viet, modern-day Vietnam, in 1224. And for a moment, a brief flickering moment in a history of men carving dynasties with swords, a little girl ruled an empire. She was the daughter of Emperor Li Huertong, a ruler slowly slipping into madness or possibly political irrelevance, which in royal terms often amounts to the same thing. The Li dynasty was crumbling, its influence eroding under the weight of infighting and an increasingly aggressive bureaucracy. Huertong, exhausted and pressured, abdicated in favor of his daughter. Not his son, not a regent, his daughter. Why? Because in his mind, it was the only way to retain dynastic control and perhaps the final chess move in a game he was losing. Little Chieu Hoang was placed on the throne and declared Empress Regnant, the first and only female monarch in Vietnamese imperial history. The court chroniclers smiled politely, wrote elegant scripts, and then got to work plotting how to fix it. Because no matter how much gold you pour into a crown, a 6-year-old girl wearing it makes the military nervous. And behind the scenes, Theodora. He was the Grand Chancellor, the real power, the political whisperer lurking behind the screen, whose entire family, the Trun clan, was on the rise. Theodora didn't believe in symbolic rule. He believed in consolidating it. So what did he do? He married Chieu Hoang off to his nephew, Tren Kine, a boy only slightly older than the Empress herself, but crucially not female. The marriage, engineered with the grace of a political gut punch, took place while she was still on the throne, and a year later, at the ripe age of 8, Chieu Hoang abdicated, technically voluntarily. Realistically, under pressure that probably felt like destiny had its hands around her tiny wrists. Her husband became Emperor Tren Thai Tong. The Tren dynasty was born, and the Li dynasty, her dynasty, ended, folded like a paper lotus and swept quietly off the altar. You might think her story ends there, that she disappeared into the background, the tragic footnote of a regime change. But no. History wasn't done passing her around like a ceremonial bowl that no one knew what to do with. As a royal woman, Chieu Hoang still had political value. She had lineage. She had symbolism. So she stayed at court, still called by her former title. But she didn't produce an heir, no sons. The one job left to her, and she couldn't complete it. For Theodora, this was unacceptable. He pressured the emperor, her own husband, to divorce her and marry her older sister instead. You heard that right. She was set aside for her own blood. Tren Tai Tong was reportedly conflicted. He retreated to a monastery to think about it for 3 days. Then he came back and remarried. Politics, after all, doesn't wait for your feelings. So now, Chieu Hoang wasn't just deposed. She was divorced, replaced, left dangling in a palace that no longer recognized her as wife, queen, or ruler. A ghost in silk robes, her every title repurposed and handed to someone else with better fertility. But she wasn't done being useful. Years later, in a final act of dynastic irony, she was married off again, this time to Lê Phur Trun, a general who had defended the new Trun dynasty against Mongol invasions. It was both a reward and a symbolic gesture. A former empress, once ruler of a collapsing dynasty, married off to a soldier from the one that replaced her, not because she loved him, not because she chose him, but because her name still meant something, and someone decided it was time to use it again. Did she love Lê Phur Trun? Maybe. Did he love her? Possibly. Historical records aren't known for capturing emotional nuance. What we do know is that they had children. She lived out her life in relative peace, no throne, no titles, no illusions. Just a woman whose life had been orchestrated from birth, like a pageant on a burning ship. She died sometime in her 60s, quietly, without ceremony, without the title she once held as a child. The only female ruler in Vietnam's imperial history remembered mostly for the way her power was taken rather than how it was used. Which feels like a fitting summary of how most empresses get written out of history, not with a bang, but with a footnote. Yet in her quiet way, Chieu Hoang did something unthinkable. She sat on the throne, she ruled, even if only for a moment, even if only through the strings of others. And she was a reminder, terrifying to the men around her, that power could exist in a girl's hands, even if only long enough to terrify everyone into taking it back. The queen who follows her didn't rule as a girl. She came to power through blood, marriage, and an empire on fire. She outlived 2 kings, became a Holy Roman Empress, and spent her life being either adored or assassinated, metaphorically or otherwise. Her name? Adelaide, and no one ever called her soft. Adelaide of Burgundy. Adelaide of Burgundy wasn't just a queen, she was a trilogy. Queen of Italy, then Empress of the Holy Roman Empire, and throughout it all, a woman who endured enough abduction, imprisonment, scandal, and political whiplash to make an HBO miniseries blush. Born around 931 CE, Adelaide arrived into the world as royalty, yes, but not yet as Destiny's favorite punching bag. That came later. At first, she was just a noble girl with impressive cheekbones and more family connections than a spiderweb made of gold. Her first marriage came when she was barely 16. She was given to Lothair II of Italy because, of course, the quickest way to stabilize a country perpetually at war with itself is to marry off a teenager. It worked, briefly. She became Queen of Italy, bore a daughter, and seemed poised to enjoy the standard miserable royal life of mild influence and high jewelry. Then Lothair was poisoned. No subtlety, just full-on medieval clunk. He died under deeply suspicious circumstances in 950, and fingers pointed to Berengar of Ivrea, the local warlord who had been circling the Italian throne like a buzzard in chainmail. Berengar didn't waste time. Within days of Lothair's death, he had Adelaide imprisoned and tried to force her to marry his son, Adalbert. Not because he loved family unity, because Adelaide had a crown, and marrying her would make the theft look legal. Now, here's where most queens fade into the background, become political hostages, whisper into the darkness, and hope history throws them a pity paragraph. But not Adelaide. She escaped. Not metaphorically, literally. She broke out of captivity, possibly disguised, possibly aided by loyalists, possibly just through sheer "I am over this" energy, and fled to Canossa, a fortified castle. From there, she sent a message north, not to a priest, not to a family member, to Otto I of Germany. Let's pause. Otto I wasn't just any German noble. He was the king of East Francia, what we now call Germany, and a man on the hunt for imperial expansion. Adelaide, widowed Queen of Italy, was the perfect justification for Otto to come down into Italy waving a sword and pretending it was chivalry, which is exactly what he did. Otto invaded, crushed Berengar, married Adelaide, and then had himself crowned King of Italy. Later, in 962, they were crowned Emperor and Empress of the Holy Roman Empire by the Pope himself. Because in medieval politics, nothing says blessed union like conquest and Vatican paperwork. But here's what makes Adelaide's story worth more than a footnote. She didn't disappear into Otto's shadow. She ruled beside him, actively, not just as consort, but as co-sovereign. Her name appeared on charters. She mediated between kings and nobles. She used her position to champion church reform and social welfare, meaning she pushed monasteries to do more than hoard gold and write sad poems in Latin. She was also one of the first medieval queens known to act as an intercessor between the emperor and his people, taking petitions directly and responding with both mercy and diplomacy. Adelaide didn't just wear the crown, she worked it. When Otto died in 973, she could have retired into widowhood, lived out her days lighting candles and bossing around servants. Instead, she kept going. Her son, Otto II, took the throne. Unfortunately, he also took issue with how much influence his mother still had. He pushed her out of court, stripped her of titles, and sent her off like a naughty schoolmistress who overstayed her welcome. But Adelaide didn't sulk. She waited. And when Otto II died prematurely in 983, because of course he did, she returned to power as regent for her grandson, Otto III. She was now grandmother, dowager empress, and regent of the Holy Roman Empire all at once. Think about that. She went from imprisoned widow to de facto ruler of the most powerful state in Europe. And she did it without raising a sword or burning a heretic. Just with patience, intelligence, and a face that said, "Yes, I will outlive all of you." She governed as regent for 5 years, balancing factions, appeasing nobles, and keeping her grandson from getting assassinated by every German duke with a pointy stick. Then, when Otto III came of age, she stepped aside, gracefully, deliberately, because unlike most rulers, Adelaide actually understood when to leave. She spent her final years in monastic service, building churches, funding abbeys, feeding the poor. Not out of guilt, not out of weakness, but because she believed power wasn't just something you seized. It was something you left behind, a legacy of influence, stability, and yes, holy PR. She died in 999, right before the world panicked about the first millennium ending. Some saw her as a saint, others as a strategist, cloaked in incense. Both were right. She was canonized in 1097 because medieval sainthood often begins with surviving 3 political executions and ends with a well-funded cathedral. Adelaide of Burgundy lived through 2 husbands, an abduction, an empire, a regency, and multiple betrayals. She didn't fight with swords. She fought with presence, with policy, with the kind of dignity that frightened lesser men into silence. And still, after all of that, her greatest triumph was that she died peacefully. No poison, no strangling, no power grab at the last breath. But if Adelaide rose through patience, the queen who follows her chose chaos. She married 2 men, and then married a kingdom. And when she took Jerusalem, she didn't just sit on the throne. She dragged it straight into hell with her. Sibylla of Jerusalem. Sibylla of Jerusalem was not a queen who ascended the throne so much as she crash-landed on it, barefoot, bruised, and dragging a crown behind her like a blood-stained veil. Her reign was short, chaotic, and morally messy, the political equivalent of lighting a kingdom on fire to prove you know where the matches are. And of course, she married twice. The first time for form. The second time for chaos. Let's rewind. Born around 1160 to Amalric I, king of Jerusalem, and his first wife, Agnes of Courtenay, Sibylla, came into the world with a crown already hanging over her crib and a curse wrapped around it. The kingdom of Jerusalem was a crusader state, a fragile, sun-bleached fragment of Christendom, clinging to power in a land it had conquered but never truly controlled. The nobles were always at each other's throats, and everyone was convinced the apocalypse was either behind them or 5 minutes away. Into this world stepped Sibylla, royal, respected, and very much in the way. She was the king's only legitimate daughter, which made her politically priceless and personally doomed. Her half-brother, Baldwin IV, Sibylla's closest ally and fiercest complication, would become king. He was brave, devout, and tragically afflicted with leprosy, which meant he wouldn't live long. couldn't have children, and made succession planning the medieval equivalent of roulette with extra knives. Sibylla's first marriage was to William of Montferrat, an Italian noble with decent family connections, modest charisma, and the life expectancy of a poisoned sandwich. They married in 1176. He died less than a year later, leaving her pregnant and widowed at around 16. She gave birth to a son, Baldwin V, who would later wear the crown himself for a brief, ghost-like stint before dying young. Because that's how this kingdom worked. Every heir was either dying, dead, or just waiting to be betrayed. As a young widow and mother of the king's only viable heir, Sibylla was now the most valuable woman in the Holy Land and the most manipulated. Courtiers scrambled to marry her off again. The goal wasn't romance. It was leverage. Control her, and you controlled the crown. Enter Guy of Lusignan. Ah, Guy, ambitious, handsome, French, and widely disliked by everyone who'd ever met him. Rumor has it Baldwin IV warned Sibylla not to marry him. But she did anyway, either out of personal choice or political pressure, so thick you could carve it with a scimitar. The wedding happened in 1180, seemingly overnight, before anyone could stop it. And from that point forward, everything in Jerusalem began to fall apart faster than a crusader's armor in a heat wave. When Baldwin IV died in 1185, Sibylla's young son from her first marriage, Baldwin V, became king. Sibylla stepped into the role of Queen Mother, but Baldwin V was weak, sickly, and surrounded by vultures in silk robes. He died within a year. Now the kingdom needed a ruler. The court split. Some wanted Sibylla, some demanded she be excluded unless she divorced Guy. The nobility loathed him, blaming his ambition for the kingdom's instability. So Sibylla made a deal. She agreed to renounce her claim publicly on the condition that she would be allowed to choose the next monarch. The barons, probably thinking she'd choose someone sane and pliable, agreed. And then, in a moment of pure, unapologetic theatrical genius, Sibylla named herself Queen. Again. And then, with everyone watching, she turned and named Guy as her king consort. A full-circle coup, with extra salt. The coronation went forward. The nobles choked on their fury, and Sibylla ruled, briefly. Trapped in a royal soap opera with stakes so high they included the literal fate of Jerusalem. Then came Saladin. The legendary Muslim general had been waiting for a weak moment in Crusader politics, and Sibylla's reign gave him one. In 1187, Guy led the Christian forces into one of the most catastrophic military blunders of the era, the Battle of Hattin. Saladin crushed the Crusaders, captured Guy, and took Jerusalem. The city was lost, the cross fell, the queen had no capital. But Sibylla, she refused to give up. While Guy was rotting in captivity, she remained queen in name, wandering between the last Crusader strongholds, writing letters, begging for aid, and still pretending there was a crown somewhere on her head. When Richard the Lionheart arrived for the Third Crusade, she was already on borrowed time. And then because, of course, plague struck. Sibylla died in 1190, likely from illness, possibly from sheer exhaustion, and definitely too young. Her two daughters, also sick, died with her. Guy, released from prison, tried to continue ruling, but without her, he was just a Frenchman shouting in Latin. History rarely knows what to do with Sibylla. She wasn't wise, she wasn't a saint, she didn't lead armies or build empires. But she did something far more complicated. She played the long game in a kingdom that didn't think women could even hold the dice. She gambled her entire crown on a man no one respected and lost, but not without making everyone watch. And the queen who comes next? She did the same, but with far more control. First married to the King of England, then to his enemy's son, always a step ahead, always underestimated. Until suddenly, she wasn't a queen through marriage, she was the mother of an empire. Isabella of Angouleme. Isabella of Angouleme had the face of a queen and the instincts of a cat burglar. She wasn't just beautiful, she was dangerously so, in a way that made kings forget strategy and barons forget their titles. She entered the political stage as a pawn, played the game like a knight, and left the board with the crown in one hand and a grudge in the other. 2 husbands, 2 kingdoms, and one long-running scandal that outlived her, all before she hit 50. She began as a French countess, heiress to the county of Angouleme, a small but strategically inconvenient patch of land nestled between English-held Aquitaine and French-controlled territory. Her bloodline was noble enough to be useful, but not prestigious enough to be dangerous, perfect for marriage. And her first engagement? Already sealed by the time she was about 12. She was betrothed to Chieu Hoang of Luxembourg, a local lord whose family had been quietly building a regional empire while everyone else was busy stabbing each other over who owned Normandy. Then King John of England showed up and broke everything. John, yes, that John, the one with the bad PR, the lost crown jewels, and the permanent footnote in every Magna Carta discussion, saw Isabella, took one look, and said, "Mine." He was 33. She was around 12. He was already married but got that annulled in the time it takes to boil an egg. Hugh of Lusignan had to stand there, blinking, as the King of England stole his fiancée and turned her into a queen. It was a diplomatic crime and a political blunder. Isabella became Queen of England in 1200. France, furious that John had bypassed their approval for the marriage, used it as an excuse to confiscate his lands. War erupted, territories burned, and Isabella, now 15, was crowned in Westminster, while half the continent tried to kill her husband. As queen, Isabella played the role history expected of her, glamorous, fertile, and largely silent. She gave John 5 children, including the future King Henry III. But she was never just decorative. Even at a young age, she understood the theater of royalty. She knew how to project power from behind a veil, how to turn court gossip into leverage, how to wield beauty like a weapon. She wasn't consulted on military decisions. John didn't consult anyone, but she was rumored to be deeply involved in court politics. People listened when she spoke, and they whispered when she didn't. John died in 1216, collapsing from dysentery and stress after a failed military campaign and years of rebellion from his own barons. Isabella, now 28, and a widow with a crown and a minor son, suddenly found herself in a rare position, Queen Dowager of England. In theory, she could have stayed in England, served as regent, and ruled in her son's name. But Isabella was not a theory. She packed her things and sailed back to France. And then, because nothing about her life was ever straightforward, she remarried Chieu Hoang of Lusignan. Yes, the same Hugh she had jilted all those years ago. The man she'd left at the altar to become queen of a different country. And now she married him. Again. Voluntarily. Which raises questions. Was it guilt? Politics? Genuine affection? Or just a long game of dynastic chess finally reaching its endgame? Whatever the reason, the match made waves. Hugh had expected to marry her daughter, not her. Yes, daughter. But Isabella swooped in and claimed the marriage for herself. She was still young, still stunning, and still politically radioactive. Together, she and Hugh built a power base in southwestern France that threatened both the French and English crowns. They raised armies, clashed with nobles, and at one point even went to war with her own son, King Henry III, over land and inheritance rights. That's right, Isabella, mother of the King of England, led a rebellion against him. It didn't work. Henry retaliated, sending forces to crush her allies. Isabella's letters reveal a woman furious, humiliated, and unwilling to grovel. She spent her later years in Fontevraud Abbey not as a penitent nun, but as a queen in semi-retirement. She commissioned tombs, paid for lavish services, and made absolutely sure that when she died, she was buried with full royal honors. She passed in 1, 2, 4, 6 in her early 50s. Not poor, not disgraced, just out of the game, but her legacy still smoldering. Isabella was the kind of queen you underestimated at your peril. Married first by theft, married second by audacity, and remembered not for her humility, but for her refusal to be anyone's pawn. She bent kingdoms to her will, turned scandal into leverage, and played the long game with unmatched elegance. And the queen who follows her? She also knew how to survive a royal scandal, married first to a would-be king, then to a real one. Her life spanned crusades, courtly love, and one very public catastrophe involving her second husband and a suspiciously timed poisoning. Margaret of France. Margaret of France lived a life that reads like the world's most beautifully scripted afterthought. She was a princess of France, twice married, twice crowned, and twice widowed each time by a man who seemed destined for glory and ended in an anticlimax. If history were fair, she'd be remembered for her quiet brilliance and diplomatic endurance. Instead, she's mostly remembered as a footnote on the family tree of everyone more famous than her. But let's fix that, shall we? Born around 1158, Margaret was the daughter of Louis VII of France and Constance of Castile, making her the half-sister of the infamous Philip II, and more importantly, the niece of every royal conflict in Europe at the time. She was born into the Capetian dynasty, a bloodline so thick with ambition it practically leaked into the architecture. Her father was still licking his wounds from his broken marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine, the original Chaos Queen of France and England, and Margaret was part of his political rebound strategy. At age 3, Margaret was betrothed to Henry the young king, son of Henry II of England, and yes, Eleanor. It was a diplomatic olive branch drenched in passive aggression. The Capetians and Plantagenets had been tearing each other apart for decades, and a royal marriage between toddler Margaret and not yet sulking Henry was supposed to bring peace. It did not. But it did bring spectacle. Margaret was packed off to England while still a child, growing up in a court that was equal parts war room, theater stage, and dysfunctional family reunion. By the time she was 15, she and Henry were officially married. She was crowned Queen of England, technically Queen of the young king, which meant she had all the ceremony and none of the political influence. Because Henry the young king was a king in title only. His father, Henry II, had crowned him during his own lifetime, a move meant to cement dynastic continuity and preempt rebellion. Instead, it created exactly the opposite. The young king was rich in title, poor in authority, and infamously bad at waiting. He wanted real power. His father said, "Not yet." Margaret, caught between them, became the queen of a man who was technically a king, but practically a frustrated teenager with an army. The marriage itself was fine, politically strategic, personally functional, romantically indifferent. Margaret spent much of it in the background, occasionally visiting France, occasionally mediating between the various factions of her husband's endless rebellions. Because yes, the young king rebelled against his own father twice, and when he wasn't rebelling, he was jousting, partying, or sulking. In a different era, he might have invented indie rock. In 1183, Henry the young king died of dysentery while on campaign. He was 28. Margaret was widowed at around 25. She had no surviving children, no dowry returned, and, at least according to rumors, no warm memories. So what did she do? She went back to France and waited. She might have spent the rest of her life in a convent. Many royal widows did. Instead, she married again, this time to Bela III of Hungary, a king in full, no young in the title. No rebellion in the bloodstream. Bela was a mature ruler, with a real throne and real power, and when he married Margaret in 1186, she became Queen of Hungary, again. This second act of Margaret's life is less chaotic, but no less remarkable. She served as a queen consort in a foreign court, adapted quickly to new customs, and integrated herself into Hungarian royal politics with more grace than her earlier Plantagenet in-laws ever mustered. She had no surviving children from this marriage either, but Bela clearly valued her deeply. She was treated with honor, given ceremonial prominence, and remembered in Hungary as a stabilizing presence during a reign that desperately needed it. Bela died in 1196, and just like that, Margaret was widowed again. Now, in her late 30s, she returned to France once more, not as a desperate widow, but as a twice-crowned queen with more political clout than most of her younger male relatives. But power has an expiration date, especially for women, and Margaret chose quiet dignity over courtly power struggles. She retired to the Abbey of Saint-Aubin in Angers, a royal monastery with enough prestige and political insulation to keep her safe from the chaos that followed. She died in 1197, barely a year after Bela's death. Not with a crown on her head, but with two behind her and a legacy no one quite knew what to do with. No statues, no epic poems. Just a life spent weaving together dynasties with patience, silence, and precisely no drama of her own. And that's what makes Margaret so fascinating. She lived at the center of two courts, both trembling on the edge of revolution, and somehow remained untouched by scandal. In a world where queens were often judged by how loudly they fell or how many sons they produced, Margaret was quiet, childless, and unforgettable if you were paying attention. She understood power not as spectacle but as stability, and her two marriages, one to a boy king, one to a battle-tested monarch, proved she could adapt, survive, and influence without ever needing a dagger or a rebellion. But not every queen chose such restraint. The woman who comes next married 3 men, outlived empires, and played Byzantine politics like a blood sport. Where Margaret walked quietly through royal courts, this next queen marched through them like she owned the walls, and sometimes she did. Agnes of France. Agnes of France wasn't born to rule, but she was born too close to power to ever escape it. A French princess thrown into the deep end of Byzantine politics, she became empress by accident, then widow by design, then pawn, wife, and symbol in a game so ruthless it made Western royal courts look like a summer picnic. She was married 3 times, once to a boy emperor, once to a monster, and finally to a mercenary who didn't even bother pretending it was about love. And through it all, Agnes remained the polite, diplomatic ghost, drifting through palace halls until the empire fell apart around her, and she simply walked out the door. She was the daughter of Louis VII of France and his second wife, Constance of Castile, making her the younger half-sister of Margaret of France, who had already done a 2-marriage victory lap through England and Hungary. So Agnes had the royal blood. She had the name. She had the pedigree. What she didn't have, at least at first, was any idea what she was walking into. In 1171, at just 8 years old, she was sent to Constantinople to marry the Byzantine Emperor Alexios II Komnenos. He was 10. This was not a love story. It was a geopolitical chess move. France wanted a Byzantine alliance. The Eastern Roman Empire wanted Western credibility. So they traded children. Agnes, fluent in nothing but French and formalities, was crowned Empress of the Romans before she could conjugate Greek verbs. Her life at court was not a fairy tale. Alexios II, though sweet-natured, was a puppet. The real power was held by his mother, Maria of Antioch, a Latin woman trying to steer a suspicious, xenophobic, decaying empire full of angry Greek nobles who hated her for being foreign, Catholic, and female. Agnes, 10 years old and just as foreign, was hardly a unifying figure. She was symbolic, decorative, trapped. And then, in 1183, Alexios II was murdered. He was still a teenager. Strangled on the orders of his cousin, Andronikos I Komnenos, a man whose name is still muttered in Byzantine history like a curse whispered into broken glass. Andronikos had returned from exile, seized the court, and declared himself emperor. To give his coup some thin veneer of legitimacy, he married Agnes, yes, the teenage widow of his murdered cousin. She was about 12. He was in his 60s. Even for Byzantium, it was obscene. Andronikos was not subtle. He governed through terror, public executions, and acts of performative sadism. He had enemies flayed in the streets, blinded nobles for sport, and once reportedly had a man buried up to his neck and then fed to dogs as a warning. He was obsessed with order, but ruled like a lunatic on fire. Agnes, still a child, now stood beside him as his empress. No real power, no real voice, just a French girl watching blood run down marble steps while her new husband smiled at the screams. It didn't last. In 1185, Andronikos was overthrown in a spectacularly violent, popular revolt. He was captured, tortured for days, and finally torn to pieces by an enraged mob. His corpse was paraded through the city headless, eyeless, dismembered because Byzantines never did subtlety when it came to regime change. And what happened to Agnes? She survived. Somehow. Miraculously, perhaps because no one saw her as dangerous, perhaps because she'd learned how to vanish in plain sight. She reappears a few years later, not as an empress, not as a princess, but as the partner, possibly wife, though some historians dispute the legalities of Theodore Branas, a Greek general and frontier nobleman who, like most men in her life, had more ambition than manners. Branas was no emperor, but he was powerful, competent, and importantly not insane. Together, they managed estates. They governed small territories. They raised a daughter. And Agnes, for the first time in her life, seemed to actually live rather than perform. She witnessed the fall of Constantinople in 1204, when the Fourth Crusade, led by Western knights who were supposed to be helping defend Christianity, decided instead to loot the capital of Christendom. The Latin Crusaders sacked the city, burned churches, destroyed libraries, and installed their own puppet emperor. Agnes, the French-born former empress, now found herself living in a city controlled by men who spoke her language but knew nothing of her story. And yet again, she survived. She kept her lands. Branas served under the new regime. Agnes, now in her 40s, watched her third government rise and fall without shedding a drop of public blood. She remained a symbol familiar to the French, respected by the Byzantines, useful to the Latins. No one ever quite knew what to make of her, and that was her greatest weapon. She died quietly. No dramatic exit. No burning palace. No final speech. Agnes of France had no recorded sons, no empire of her own, no great military conquests. And yet, she managed to be queen 3 times in a world where most women couldn't survive once. She was a foreigner in every palace she lived in, a bride to boys, monsters, and mercenaries. A ghost in the heart of an empire that tore itself apart again and again while she floated above the wreckage. But if Agnes was the ghost of an empire, the next queen was its empress. Not through marriage, through conquest. She was Napoleon's bride, then his exile, then her own reclamation. And in the end, she buried one emperor and married 2 more men just to remind Europe that no revolution is complete without a very well-dressed widow. Marie-Louise of Austria. Marie-Louise of Austria was the kind of royal woman history likes to shelve awkwardly, somewhere between tragic pawn and opportunistic survivor. She was Napoleon's second wife, yes. But to stop there is to miss the opera, because Marie-Louise didn't just marry a man, she married a continent in flames. She watched empires rise and implode in real time, bore a child destined to inherit the whole bloody mess, then quietly walked away and remarried 2 more times like the entire French imperial collapse was just a particularly unfortunate summer romance. Born in 1791, Marie-Louise was an Archduchess of Austria, daughter of Francis II, Holy Roman Emperor, which meant that from birth she was raised in the cold marble shadow of diplomacy, courtly silence, and really unfortunate portraits. Her childhood wasn't marked by happiness, but by the Napoleonic Wars, that never-ending series of battles, treaties, betrayals, and costume changes where her future husband was, quite literally, the enemy of her entire family. In fact, as a teenager, she hated him. Napoleon, to her, was the short Corsican general who had humiliated her father, dissolved the Holy Roman Empire, invaded Vienna, and probably burned every fairy tale she'd ever been told about princesses and their princes. She called him the Ogre of Corsica. Charming. Then, in 1810, she married him. Because of course she did. After his disastrous first marriage to Josephine, who was too old, too barren, and too French for Napoleon's ambitions, he needed a fertile, legitimate, blue-blooded European wife who could stitch together a proper dynasty. And Marie-Louise was the sacrificial lamb in pearls. She was 18, he was 40. She did not meet him until after the marriage had been arranged. And then she crossed the continent into the glittering rot of Paris, stripped of her Austrian attendants, her German language, and any illusion of autonomy. But here's where it gets twisted. She adapted. Marie-Louise threw herself into the role of Empress of the French. She learned French, smiled at the court, rode next to her new husband in parades, birthed the King of Rome, Napoleon's long-awaited heir, less than a year later. Her son's birth was greeted with cannon fire, national euphoria, and the sort of expectations usually reserved for deities and doomed protagonists. And for a moment, she was adored. But then Napoleon started losing. It began with Spain, then Russia, then everywhere else. Europe turned against him like a badly written tragedy. The emperor who had once crowned himself began losing battles, soldiers, allies. In 1814, the coalition armies closed in. Paris was taken. Napoleon abdicated and was exiled to Elba. And Marie-Louise? She didn't follow him. That's the part most people skip over. The teenage girl who had once been forced to marry her father's enemy now had the chance to choose, and she chose not to be dragged down with him. Her father, always the political calculator, reclaimed her. She was sent to Parma, in Italy, and made Duchess in her own right. She took her son with her at first, but then he was taken too. Marie-Louise never saw him again. Now 23 years old. Twice abandoned by war and by fate, she started over. And she married again. Enter Adam Albert von Neipperg, her chamberlain and personal envoy. He had a patch over one eye, scars from fighting Napoleon, and the sort of quiet masculinity that doesn't need declarations of grandeur. He was the complete opposite of her first husband, which might have been the point. They married morganatically, that is, not as equals, meaning he would never be king, and their children would never inherit the duchy. But for the first time, Marie-Louise chose her husband, and she stayed with him for over a decade, until his death. Then, because the world wasn't done with her yet, she married a third time. Her final husband was Charles René, Count of Bombelles, another Austrian diplomat with a serviceable mustache and a respectable sense of discretion. By this point, Marie-Louise had outlived Napoleon Napoleon, her own son, who died of tuberculosis at 21, and half the people who once bowed to her. She married Bombelles not for politics, not for passion, but for peace. She died in 1847 at the age of 56, having lived through more regime changes than a history textbook. She had been Empress of the French, Duchess of Parma, and widow of both a conqueror and a general. She had worn the crown of the most feared empire in Europe, then quietly passed it along like a broken heirloom. And history, ever conflicted, never knew what to do with her. Was she a traitor? A survivor? A tragic victim of dynastic roulette? Or just a woman who got tired of men burning down countries to prove they had a point? Either way, Marie-Louise was no one's fantasy. She was too quiet for that, too practical. But she was a queen 3 times over, once by force, twice by choice, and in the end, it was her quietness that endured. Not Napoleon's speeches, not his battlefield maps. Just her signature on a duchy's budget, her children's names in ledgers, and a fading imperial portrait of a woman who once held the world's most powerful man in her arms and then lived long enough to hold better ones. And while Marie-Louise distanced herself from war's wreckage, the next queen didn't run from conquest. She was the conquest. She seduced emperors, poisoned siblings, and carved her throne out of incest and empire. She didn't just survive the Ptolemaic dynasty, she defined it. Cleopatra VII. Cleopatra VII didn't just rule Egypt, she marketed it. She wasn't a queen in the traditional crown on head sit and smile sense. She was a tactician, a performer, a linguist, a warlord, and yes, a serial royal spouse. She married not 1, not 2, but 3 of the most politically combustible men in the ancient world, 2 of them her own brothers, and the other a Roman general with impulse control issues. But if that sounds like a scandal, congratulations, you've grasped the bare minimum of Ptolemaic family politics. Let's start with the incest, because the Ptolemies never eased you in. Born around 69 BCE, Cleopatra VII was the last ruler of the Ptolemaic dynasty, a line of Macedonian Greeks who had ruled Egypt since Alexander the Great's general, Ptolemy I, decided he liked pyramids and absolute power. The dynasty was rich, corrupt, and built on a foundation of highly suspicious family trees. Marriage between siblings wasn't optional, it was expected. The gods supposedly approved, the genealogists definitely lied. So when her father, Ptolemy XII, nicknamed Auletes, meaning the flutist, because ancient rulers could also have stage names, died in 51 BCE, Cleopatra took the throne alongside her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII. She was 18, he was 10. They were co-rulers, also husband and wife. If you feel queasy, you're not alone. But in Ptolemaic Egypt, that just meant it was Tuesday. Cleopatra immediately took control. She was brilliant, multilingual, educated, charismatic. She spoke at least 7 languages. She read philosophy, studied medicine, and could likely quote Homer while assassinating your political credibility. But her brother's regents weren't interested in letting a young woman rule, especially one who didn't smile when told to be quiet. Within a few years, she was exiled from Alexandria, forced to regroup in Syria and raise an army. Enter Julius Caesar. It's 48 BCE. Caesar arrives in Egypt chasing his rival Pompey, who had fled to Alexandria only to be promptly murdered, a diplomatic faux pas of such magnitude that Caesar nearly left immediately. Cleopatra, now in her early 20s and looking for a way back into power, saw her moment. She didn't just send a letter. She had herself smuggled into the palace inside a rug, or more accurately, a linen sack which was unrolled before Caesar like a sexy Trojan horse. He was intrigued. She was strategic. They became lovers almost instantly. With Caesar's military backing and her own ruthless political savvy, Cleopatra defeated her brother's forces. Ptolemy XIII drowned in the Nile while fleeing probably one of the better fates available in this family. Cleopatra then married another younger brother, Ptolemy XIV, again to preserve the illusion of dynastic continuity. She ruled alone in all but name. Caesar returned to Rome. Cleopatra followed, bringing along their son, Caesarion, literally Little Caesar, a name that would eventually become far more famous for pizza than for politics. The Roman Senate was scandalized. Caesar's mistress was not only foreign, not only a queen, not only wildly intelligent, but also not dead yet, which was a problem. Then Caesar was assassinated in 44 BCE. Cleopatra, suddenly widowed in spirit, if not in paperwork, fled back to Egypt and had her third husband, Ptolemy XIV, quietly poisoned. Her son Caesarion became her new co-ruler at the age of 3, because why stop now? Fast forward a few years. Rome is in chaos. Mark Antony, general, orator, drinker of all things alcoholic, is 1/3 of a very unstable ruling triumvirate. He invites Cleopatra to meet him in Tarsus. She sails in dressed as the goddess Isis on a gold-trimmed barge, with perfumes wafting downriver before the boat even arrives. Antony, a man with the strategic foresight of a distracted puppy, falls for her instantly. They become lovers. She bears him 3 children. They rule as an unofficial Eastern monarchy, promoting themselves as divine. Rome, meanwhile, watches in horror as Antony begins distributing Roman territories as baby gifts. The Western Empire, led by the cold and calculating Octavian, later Augustus, declares war. The Battle of Actium in 31 BCE is not just a military disaster, it's a PR catastrophe. Antony and Cleopatra's combined fleet is defeated. They flee to Egypt. 1 year later, as Octavian's forces enter Alexandria, Antony falls on his sword. Cleopatra, refusing to be paraded through Rome in chains, follows suit. The popular story is that she used an asp, a venomous snake hidden in a fig basket. Maybe, maybe not. Poison was cleaner, the asp was more poetic. In either case, she died at 39, the last of her dynasty, wrapped in legend. Her death marked the end of the Hellenistic age and the beginning of Roman Egypt. Caesarion was captured and killed. Her children with Antony were taken to Rome and raised by Octavia, Antony's Roman wife, because of course he had one of those. And yet, Cleopatra endures. She ruled Egypt for 22 years, married 2 brothers, seduced 2 Roman titans, and outlasted them all for a time. She played empire like chess, using beauty, wit, and an almost terrifying ability to see where the blood would land before the blade was even drawn. She was not the seductress of myth. She was a strategist, a linguist, a ruler who had to play every card twice because the deck was stacked against her from birth. And now, as the dust of Rome settles behind us, The next queen steps out not from myth or marble halls, but from behind a silk curtain in Constantinople. She married 3 emperors, not for love, not even for empire, but for domination, and somehow she outlived them all. Zoe Porphyrogenita. Zoe Porphyrogenita was not born to be forgotten. Her very name, Porphyrogenita, born in the purple, meant she emerged into the world in the sacred birthing chamber of Constantinople's imperial palace, wrapped in silk and prophecy. Her life was not a life so much as a hostage negotiation with destiny, conducted across 4 decades, 3 husbands, and one very exhausted empire. She didn't just wear the Byzantine crown, she passed it around like a ceremonial dagger, marrying 3 emperors in succession and, on more than one occasion, ruling herself, often from a bathtub, sometimes from a blood-stained chamber. It began, as so many imperial Byzantine tragedies do, with not being a man. Zoe was born in 978 to Constantine VIII, a man so politically inert that historians routinely forget he even existed. He spent decades avoiding responsibility, while his brother Basil II did all the ruling, all the conquering, and most of the terrifying. Basil never married, never had children, and never thought Zoe or her sister Theodora should inherit. But when he died childless in 1025, Constantine finally ascended the throne and promptly panicked because he, too, had no male heirs. Enter Zoe, now in her 40s, unmarried, politically irrelevant, and suddenly the hottest piece of dynastic property in the Eastern Roman Empire. Constantine, desperately in need of an heir to continue the Macedonian dynasty, plucked a bureaucrat named Romanos Argyros from obscurity and ordered him to marry Zoe. They married on a Monday. Her father died on a Tuesday, and by Wednesday, Romanos was emperor, and Zoe was finally empress. At first, things were tolerable. Romanos was dull, pious, competent, and unfortunately determined to keep Zoe far from any real influence. He confined her to the women's quarters, issued edicts in his own name, and made it clear that Zoe was to be seen, praised, and never consulted. Naturally, she found herself a lover. Michael was a handsome courtier, charming and ambitious, everything Romanos was not. And with him, Zoe did what any sidelined Byzantine empress would do. She plotted. Romanos died in 1034, possibly drowned in his bath under circumstances that involved suspicious timing, a lack of witnesses, and a court that quietly looked the other way. The same day Romanos died, Zoe married Michael. That's not poetic exaggeration, that's the timeline. She dragged her new husband into the chapel and had him crowned Emperor Michael IV before the water had drained from the tub. Michael IV was younger than Zoe and increasingly afflicted with epilepsy. He gradually pushed Zoe aside in favor of his own brother, John the Orphanotrophos, an imperial puppeteer with about as much charm as a plague rat. Michael's reign grew paranoid and erratic. Zoe, again exiled to irrelevance, seethed behind scented curtains and watched as her adopted son Michael V was groomed to succeed the throne. When Michael IV died in 1041, Michael V ascended. He was barely 20, filled with delusions of independence, and within months banished Zoe from the palace. That was a mistake. Constantinople rioted. Citizens poured into the streets, demanding Zoe's return. They broke down palace gates. Monks joined. Merchants joined. Bakers joined. For a woman who'd been sidelined for decades, Zoe had somehow become the burning heart of the people's loyalty. Her exile lasted less than a month. Zoe was reinstated. But the empire was tired. She was now in her 60s. The court wanted stability. And for once, Zoe wanted an emperor who wouldn't drown in a bath or steal her crown. She found him in Constantine IX Monomachos. He was educated, charming, and popular also. Importantly, not already married. Their union was not passionate but functional. Constantine IX shared power with Zoe and her sister Theodora, who had finally stepped out from the shadows and into co-empress status. Yes, for a time, the Byzantine Empire was ruled by three sovereigns, Zoe, Theodora, and Constantine IX, in a kind of triarchy no one wanted to admit was working. But Zoe didn't die a revolutionary. She died a relic. She spent her final years mostly ignored by her husband, decorating churches, sponsoring monasteries, and gazing wistfully into gold-leafed icons of saints who never had to negotiate a marriage contract. She passed away in 1050, having survived 6 emperors, 3 husbands, 2 coups, and 1 very angry sister. What makes Zoe Porphyrogenita unforgettable isn't her longevity. It's that she refused to be erased. She was passed from man to man like a blood-stained crown, yet each time, she carved her initials into the throne. She played the long game with a smile and a dagger, and while the historians called her vain and emotional, the empire kept choosing her. But Zoe's saga was only half the story, because her sister Theodora, always waiting in the wings, would not be content to share power forever. She too would marry the purple, not once, but decisively. And when her time came, she would rule not as a consort, but as a sovereign, with her own crown, her own laws, and, finally, no husband at all. Theodora Porphyrogenita. If Zoe was the empress who refused to disappear, Theodora was the one who refused to be used. For most of her life, she stood in her sister's shadow, silent, obedient, watching from behind veils and courtly niceties as her bloodline was traded, married, and manipulated by emperors, eunuchs, and cousins with too many ambitions and not enough talent. But when her moment came, Theodora didn't just step into the light. She stormed into it, crown first, fury second. Like Zoe, Theodora was born Porphyrogenita, born in the purple in the sacred imperial bedchamber of the Byzantine palace, which meant her legitimacy ran as deep as the purple dye staining her swaddling cloth. But in a dynasty obsessed with male succession, she was treated like an archival document, important, but best stored out of sight. Her father, Constantine VIII, didn't groom her for rule. He didn't even arrange her marriage. He simply left her. Zoe was chosen to carry the imperial bloodline through marriage. Theodora was left unmarried, untouched, and unthreatening until she wasn't. When Zoe first married Romanos III, Theodora was ordered to marry the military commander Constantine Diogenes to secure the dynasty's future. She refused, publicly, repeatedly, with all the poise of a woman who knew that most Byzantine husbands ended up with poisoned chalices and suspicious bath accidents. Her refusal enraged her sister, who banished her to a convent. There, Theodora lived not as a recluse, but as a ticking clock. Fast forward to 1042. Michael V, the usurper Emperor Zoe, had briefly adopted exiled both sisters. He sent Zoe to a monastery and tried to consolidate power, but Constantinople had other plans. The people rioted, nobles panicked, and the crowd broke into the convent and dragged Theodora out. They marched her through the streets to the Hagia Sophia, not to pray but to proclaim her empress. Theodora didn't weep. She didn't refuse. She accepted. And on Easter Sunday, the year of our Lord 1042, the Byzantine Empire saw something it had never seen before, a double coronation, 2 middle-aged sisters crowned co-rulers, 2 women, no husbands, no male emperors behind them, just Zoe and Theodora, ruling by birthright and popular demand. This was not a polite arrangement. Zoe, always the romantic, still wanted a man beside her. She married Constantine IX later that year, and he became emperor in name, but Theodora made sure everyone remembered who actually had the legitimacy. She refused to marry. She refused to cede power. She issued laws in her name. When Constantine IX tried to edge her out of governance, she stonewalled him with a stare only an empress could master. And when Constantine died in 1055, surprise, Theodora didn't fade into mourning robes. At 70 years old, she seized sole power. She was the last of her dynasty, the last Porphyrogenita, and she had no interest in stepping aside for a convenient male cousin. The court was appalled. Ministers begged her to name a husband, a co-ruler, anyone to take the crown off her head and place it somewhere more masculine. She refused, flatly. The same Theodora who'd once been shoved into a convent now ran an empire, reorganizing the bureaucracy, firing corrupt officials, and ignoring every noble who tried to talk over her. She held court with iron discipline. No velvet smiles, no seductions, just policy. Some historians say she was cold. Others say she was efficient. All agree. She didn't care what they thought. And yet, there was irony in her final chapter. In 1056, with her health failing, Theodora finally named a successor, Michael VI, a bland bureaucrat with no charisma and no real claim. Perhaps she thought he'd be pliable. Perhaps she wanted to avoid another marriage. Perhaps, at nearly 80, she simply didn't care who cleaned up after her. She died later that year, unmarried to the end, her life bookended by forced silence and final authority. There are no marble statues of Theodora in the grand Byzantine tradition, no grand mausoleum, but her legacy is the quiet roar of refusal. She didn't seek power through men. She didn't seduce, assassinate, or manipulate. She just waited, then ruled. 3 emperors sat on the throne during her lifetime. None of them were as stable as she was. And while the empire continued to fall apart after her death because it was Byzantium, and of course it did, Theodora's reign remains one of the few flashes of female governance in an empire that preferred its women behind silk curtains. But the next queen didn't hide behind curtains. She ruled an island continent with fists, poison, and spiritual terror. She didn't just outlive her rivals. She married them again and again until the only thing left standing was her own terrifying legend, Ranavalona I. Ranavalona I was not your typical monarch. She didn't marry kings to keep peace or stitch dynasties together. She married to consolidate control, to root out threats, to build a fortress around her throne that no European gunboat or scheming noble could breach. And when she couldn't marry her way out of a problem, she crushed it with iron will and zero apology. She wasn't elegant, or diplomatic, or submissive. She was a storm in royal silk, paranoid, cunning, and profoundly terrifying. She ruled Madagascar from 1828 to 1861, and by the time she was done, entire foreign governments were afraid to pronounce her name too loudly. But let's rewind, because before she became the nightmare of colonialists and the high priestess of political purification, she was just a girl named Ramavo. Born into a noble but not royal family, she owed her rise to a mix of prophecy, adoption, and a king who crucially had no legitimate heirs. That king was Radama I, the first monarch to unify Madagascar under the Merina dynasty. He was modernizing, Francophile, and obsessed with importing European ideas into his court, including literacy, military training, and Christianity. Ramavo married him as part of a diplomatic consolidation. He had multiple wives, but she wasn't just another consort. She was politically aware, observant, and quietly building alliances behind the scenes. Radama died in 1828 without naming a successor. By the laws of primogeniture, power should have passed to a male relative. But Ranavalona, now calling herself by a name that means folded and protected, acted first. In a coup so swift it left no time for protest, she seized the throne, not with an army. With the military elite, the court officials, and the powerful spiritual class known as the Umbiacy all aligned behind her, her rivals were either exiled or executed. The succession was over in days. A woman now ruled the largest island in the Indian Ocean. And then she began the purges. She had enemies real and imagined, and she removed them with an efficiency that bordered on the supernatural. Her first husband may have brought in missionaries and schools, but Ranavalona rejected all of it. She expelled the missionaries, burned the books, and made public examples of anyone caught practicing Christianity. She saw European influence, not as modernity, but as an infection, and she vowed to purge it, root and branch. But here's where the narrative twists, because this wasn't simple xenophobia. It was calculated political survival. Ranavalona knew what had happened to other African kingdoms. She saw what France and Britain were doing to the continent. The gunboats, the treaties written in bad faith, the puppet kings. Madagascar was next unless someone slammed the door in their faces, and she did, hard. She revived ancestral customs, restored the power of traditional rituals, and made herself the living embodiment of the ancestors. She ruled as a semi-divine figure. Her word wasn't law, it was reality. Trials by Tangina, a poison ordeal involving toxic nuts, were reintroduced to test loyalty. Criminals, Christians, and political threats were all subjected to it. If you survived, you were innocent. If not, well, the ancestors had spoken. It was brutal. It was effective, and it terrified everyone. Now about those marriages. Ranavalona married 3 times. Her first and most famous marriage was to Radama I, but after his death and her ascension, she did not remain a widow. Instead, she married her prime minister, Rainiharo, a powerful military commander and political operator who helped her secure the throne. It was a partnership more than a romance. Rainiharo became her muscle, her shield, and her enforcer. Together, they ran the island like a fortified temple. When Rainiharo died, she didn't mourn for long. She married his son, Ranavalona I, as a continuation of power. Again, not for love, not even for lust, but for control. In marrying the son of her dead husband, she ensured continuity within the military elite and kept her enemies guessing. Was it nepotism, a dynasty-building move, a strategic dare? Probably all 3. She had no biological children, which would have been a crisis for any other dynasty. But not for Ranavalona. She adopted her cousin's son and raised him as heir Rakoto, who would become Radama II. But even that relationship soured. Rakoto flirted with reform, hinted at bringing back European alliances, and wrote secret letters to French officials. Ranavalona found out. She didn't execute him yet. But she tightened her grip. She let him live under surveillance, like a mouse in a gilded box. By the time she died in 1861, the world outside had changed. Steamships had become faster, colonies were spreading, but Madagascar had survived as an independent kingdom at a cost. Her reign had reduced the population by hundreds of thousands through purges, war, famine, and forced labor, but she had kept the invaders out. For 33 years, she stood between her island and the world. Today, Ranavalona is remembered with both awe and horror. She was a tyrant, a queen, a traditionalist, a visionary. She ruled not with diplomacy, but with incantation, and execution. And through it all, she married only those she could command, and commanded all those she did not marry. And if Ranavalona used marriage like a weapon, the next woman wielded it like a whispered charm. Not a queen in name, but one in ambition. A duchess twice married into the English royal line, she raised a future queen, survived a scandalous war, and conjured her legacy not with a crown, but with bloodlines. Jacquetta of Luxembourg. Jacquetta of Luxembourg was never technically a queen, but don't let that technicality fool you. She married 2 men with power in their blood, produced a daughter who would become Queen of England, and practiced a little witchcraft along the way, just to keep things interesting. In the great chaotic chess game of the Wars of the Roses, she wasn't a queen on the board, but she was the player no one realized was holding the pieces. Born around 1415 into the House of Luxembourg, Jacquetta was highborn, well-connected, and inconveniently female. In a time when that meant your most valuable political trait was how strategically you could be traded like a particularly decorative wine goblet. She descended from Charlemagne on one side and had cousins across half the continent, but it didn't matter much until fate, or maybe something stranger, positioned her beside one of England's most eligible royal bachelors. At 17, she was married to John of Lancaster, 1st Duke of Bedford. John wasn't just a duke, he was the 3rd son of Henry IV and the brother of Henry V. He had served as regent of France during the 100 Years' War, governed entire kingdoms, and fought Joan of Arc. In short, powerful, old, and politically radioactive. Their marriage was childless, cold, and short. John died in 1435, leaving Jacquetta a wealthy dowager duchess. She was still in her late teens. Now, here's where it gets scandalous. Jacquetta, now a royal widow, was expected to return to court, cry decorously, and be auctioned off again like a prized artifact. Instead, she fell in love with her late husband's squire. His name? Richard Woodville. Noble-born, yes, but nowhere near her station. The kind of man who could ride a horse well but wasn't supposed to marry duchesses, especially not duchesses who were technically still under crown guardianship. So what did Jacquetta do? She married him in secret. No royal permission. No court approval. No convenient diplomatic arrangement. Just a noblewoman who said essentially, "To hell with protocol, I want the hot one." When the court found out, the outrage was immediate. They were fined heavily, but the marriage stood, and Jacquetta, now Lady Woodville, proceeded to do what she did best, produce children, 6 sons. 8 daughters, 16 pregnancies in total, including one girl who would change the fate of England. Elizabeth Woodville. But we'll get to her in a moment. Jacquetta's life was spent in the eye of the royal hurricane. She and Richard were drawn into the shifting power games of the English court, first siding with the Lancastrians, then forced into diplomatic gymnastics as the Yorkist Edward IV rose to power. And then, plot twist, her daughter Elizabeth secretly married that Edward IV, the king, the actual, literal King of England. That's right. Jacquetta's daughter went from minor noblewoman to queen consort in a move that shocked the nobility, enraged the king's advisors, and catapulted the Woodvilles into power. Suddenly, Jacquetta was mother of the queen, grandmother to future monarchs, and the matriarch of a political machine that made every English noble with an ego feel violently ill. The Woodville clan became synonymous with ambitious in-laws, flooding court positions and marrying into every title not bolted down. And with power came paranoia. Jacquetta was accused twice of witchcraft. The charges were never subtle. One rumor claimed she used sorcery to seduce Edward IV into marrying her daughter. Another alleged She crafted magical figurines to control the minds of the king's enemies. Evidence. A lead doll buried in the garden. A few whispers. A court, desperate for a scapegoat. She was even briefly imprisoned during the political chaos of 1469. But Jacquetta was slippery. She had survived the royal courts of France and England. She had navigated widowhood, secret marriage, civil war, and royal childbirth without losing her head literally or metaphorically. She was cleared of charges both times and returned to court life like nothing had happened. Was she actually a witch? Well, that depends on your definition. She was certainly a woman who controlled her own fate, made her own choices, and arranged marriages like a chess master while men around her were busy stabbing each other over flags. If that's not witchcraft, it's close enough for medieval standards. She died in 1472, just a few years before the Wars of the Roses hit their blood-soaked climax. She didn't live to see her daughter Elizabeth dethroned. She didn't witness the brief rise of her grandsons Edward V and the tragic princes in the Tower. But her fingerprints are on every page of that chapter of history. Jacquetta never wore a crown. She never ruled a kingdom. But she passed through courtly fires and came out the other side with her legacy intact. She married up, then married way down but always upward in ambition. She outmaneuvered kings, duchesses, and witches' trials, and raised a dynasty from a scandal. And speaking of scandal, the next queen was scandal incarnate. A Tudor by blood, a Stuart by marriage, a mother of kings, and a professional widow. She married 3 men, 2 of them badly, one of them even worse, and never once surrendered her place at the political feast. Margaret Tudor. Margaret Tudor was what happens when royal blood meets bad luck, and worse husbands. She was the sister of Henry VIII. Yes, that Henry, and like all Tudors, she came preloaded with ego, ambition, and the misfortune of being born a woman in a family where only the loudest man got to shout. But Margaret didn't need a throne to leave a legacy. She married 3 men, mothered a dynasty, started a civil war or 2, and still found time to feud with her brother, outwit Scottish lords, and raise future kings with the same casual chaos that Henry used for executions. Born in 1489 to Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, Margaret was Tudor royalty from head to toe. Her childhood was brief, structured, and political. By age 13, she was engaged. By 14, she was married. Her first husband, James IV of Scotland. It was a peace treaty wearing a wedding dress. The year was 1503. England and Scotland had been at each other's throats for centuries, and this marriage was supposed to end the bloodshed. Spoiler alert, it didn't. But for a moment, Margaret Tudor was the glittering teenage queen consort of Scotland, arriving in Edinburgh with a retinue, a wardrobe, and the heavy burden of being both English and Protestant in a Catholic kingdom that barely tolerated either. Her marriage to James IV was surprisingly functional for a time. He was older, charismatic, a seasoned ruler with a penchant for war and women. She was young, intelligent, politically astute, and fluent in courtly patience. They had 6 children, though only one survived, James, the future James V of Scotland. The others died in infancy or childhood, a pattern that would haunt Margaret's entire life, losing children and husbands with the same grim regularity as Tudor alliances. Then came the first catastrophe. In 1513, while her brother Henry VIII was off fighting the French, James IV decided brilliantly to invade England. It was a disaster. He was killed at the Battle of Flodden, one of the bloodiest battles between the 2 kingdoms. His body was so hacked and battered it was nearly unrecognizable. He left behind a toddler son and a queen suddenly upgraded to regent, a widow, yes, but now the power behind the miniature throne. This is where Margaret should have faded into royal widowhood. Instead, she got busy. She was named Regent of Scotland for her son James V, but being English made her instantly suspect among the fiercely independent Scottish lords, and her position was tenuous from the start. So what did she do to stabilize her power? She married again. This time, she picked Archibald Douglas, 6th Earl of Angus, a nobleman with ambition but no real influence, until Margaret handed it to him. The marriage was secret, reckless, and politically idiotic. The moment it was discovered, her regency was revoked, her alliances fractured, and her enemies delighted. The Scottish nobles saw it as a betrayal of trust and worse, a sign that she was just another woman who would trade national interest for a charming face and mediocre title. Her second marriage soured faster than old wine. Douglas quickly revealed himself to be controlling, power-hungry, and self-serving. He effectively kidnapped her son, the young king, and kept him under lock and key in Edinburgh, ruling through him like a cartoon villain with a crown. Margaret, humiliated and cut off from her own child, tried everything to regain influence: letters to Henry VIII, secret correspondences with European allies, even staging a near-failed escape from Edinburgh dressed in disguise. Eventually, the marriage crumbled completely. She separated from Douglas, tried to have the marriage annulled, and after years of political limbo got the Pope's permission. That wasn't easy. Divorce was not a popular sport in the pre-Henry VIII days, but Margaret, like her brother, had a talent for asking impossible things loudly enough that someone eventually said yes. Her third and final marriage was to Henry Stuart, Lord Methven, a man with neither the resources nor the cunning to threaten her position, which may have been exactly the point. It was less of a power play, more of a sigh. By now, Margaret had lost her regency, been exiled and reinstated, and watched her son become king in his own right. She was no longer at the center of Scottish politics, but she still pulled strings where she could. What makes Margaret Tudor remarkable isn't just her 3 husbands, it's the survival between them. She governed, rebelled, negotiated, fled, returned, and rebuilt more often than most queens redecorated. Her letters are full of frustrated intelligence, cutting sarcasm, and occasional desperation. She knew the game, she knew how it was rigged against her, and she played anyway. And perhaps most importantly, she started a bloodline. Her grandson, James I of Scotland, would become James I of England after Elizabeth I died without an heir. That's right, Margaret's line won. Quietly. Eventually. Through generations of marital disasters and diplomatic breakdowns, she still came out ahead. But if Margaret Tudor was the patient flame behind dynastic fire, the next queen burned with full imperial heat. Born a concubine, she became the only woman in Chinese history to wear the dragon robe of an emperor, not consort, not regent, but empress regnant. And she didn't just break the rules. She rewrote them line by line while her rivals conveniently disappeared. Zetian. Zetian didn't just rule China, she made sure no one forgot she had done it, even if it meant carving her legacy into a blank stone stale and daring history to fill in the rest. She was the only woman to ever officially claim the title of Emperor of China. Not Empress Consort, not Empress Dowager. Emperor, singular, absolute. And she didn't marry for sentiment or safety or even alliance. She married emperors to replace them. She took lovers like officials took bribes. And every time someone whispered that women didn't belong on the throne, they mysteriously stopped whispering or just stopped, period. Born around 624 CE during the Tang dynasty, Zetian started life as the daughter of a wealthy timber merchant. That's already a red flag. because the idea of a woman from a merchant family becoming ruler of the largest empire on earth sounds less like a biography and more like a myth created by a bureaucrat who drank too much rice wine. But her family was unusually progressive. Her father encouraged her education, and she learned to read and write in an era when women were expected to stay literate only in embroidery patterns and polite silence. At 14, she was sent to the court of Emperor Taizong as a concubine. Not a wife, not even a particularly important concubine. One of many, filed away in the imperial harem like a living piece of furniture. She started at the bottom, serving tea and occasionally being noticed. Then Taizong died, and as was tradition, all his concubines were supposed to retire into a Buddhist convent where they could contemplate eternity and be forgotten. Wu Zetian had other plans. Instead of fading into the incense-scented background, she seduced Taizong's son, Emperor Gaozong. Yes, her former stepson, or more precisely, the man who would become her second imperial husband. He remembered her from court, liked her better than any of his other women, and once she entered his private chambers again, she never left. They married, against the protests of nearly every Confucian official in the bureaucracy. She wasn't from a noble family. She had already served one emperor. She was a woman with opinions. That was 3 strikes already, but Gaozong didn't care. He made her empress consort in 655, replacing his first wife, who, depending on which account you believe, was either deposed through courtly politics or strangled with a sash under suspicious circumstances involving a Buddhist nun and a disappearing baby. By 660, Gaozong's health declined, and Wu Zetian began issuing imperial edicts in his name. By 665, she was co-ruler in all but title. And when he died in 683, she didn't step aside. She ruled through her sons, first Zhongzong, then Ruizong, using them like puppets with unfortunate bowl cuts, pulling their strings until they said the wrong thing. Then she replaced them, exiled one, threatened the other, and finally, in 690, she declared herself Emperor of China. Not Empress. That title was reserved for women behind the curtain. Wu Zetian removed the curtain. She took on the full imperial role, complete with new regnal titles, a new dynasty, the Zhou, and a complete reworking of the bureaucratic system to allow men of lower birth, not just aristocrats, to rise through merit. It was revolutionary, terrifying, and very, very effective. Her court was efficient. Her spy network was legendary. She had secret police before it was cool. And when ministers tried to revolt or criticize her, they ended up exiled, executed, or turned into anecdotes. She was ruthless but not aimless. She funded massive construction projects, revived agriculture, promoted Buddhism as a counterweight to Confucian patriarchy, and sponsored scholars who conveniently praised her as the earthly incarnation of the Bodhisattva Maitreya. She also had lovers. After Gaozong's death, she took on 2 young men, Zhang Yizhi and Zhang Changzong, as personal companions. They were beautiful, charming, and utterly devoted. Court gossip said she kept them near for pleasure. Historians call them favorites, which is polite court, speak for bedwarmers with official titles. She promoted them, protected them, and surrounded herself with loyalists who didn't mind the unconventional optics of a 70-something empress with boy toys and an iron grip on the throne. In 705, old, sick, and under pressure from factions loyal to her exiled son, Wu Zetian finally abdicated. She died soon after. Her tombstone was left deliberately blank because no one dared summarize her life in stone. What would they even write? Here lies the only woman who emperored emperors. Wu Zetian was not the result of circumstance. She was the consequence of ambition honed to a knife's edge. She married one emperor, then became one. She ruled through sons, then over them. She came from nowhere and ended in the center of everything, daring an entire civilization to question her legitimacy. And while China tried to bury her legacy under layers of Confucian disapproval, the next queen ruled a very different kingdom, one where queens were warriors, rulers, and sometimes sisters to their own consorts. She didn't just take lovers, she may have married more than one at a time. Because in Silla, Korea, power wasn't just about birth, it was about how many names history dared to write on her husband, Queen Seondeok of Silla. If Wu Zetian rewrote the imperial handbook, then Queen Seondeok of Silla left a copy under her pillow and annotated it in calligraphy, poetry, and ruthless political maneuvering. Ruling a Korean kingdom in the 7th century, Seondeok didn't just take the throne. She lit a lamp in the middle of a temple, pointed to the heavens, and reminded everyone, nobles, monks, and generals alike, that wisdom in a woman was not a liability. It was an omen. And she had more than enough omens to go around. Seondeok was born into the royal family of Silla, one of the 3 kingdoms of Korea, back when Korea was less a nation and more a messy set of rival cousins throwing arrows and philosophy at each other. Her lineage was impeccable. Her intellect was quietly terrifying. And by the time she reached adulthood, she had memorized more Chinese classics than most of her male contemporaries could pronounce. The problem: she was a woman. And in the 7th century, female monarchs were considered as plausible as flying dragons. Which, ironically, was another thing Seondeok claimed to have seen. But back to the politics. Her father, King Jinpyong, had no sons. What he had was 3 daughters, all educated, all sharp, all born under inauspicious stars, or so the ministers said. When Jinpyong named Seondeok his heir, eyebrows weren't just raised. They tried to launch a coup. Ministers argued that women couldn't command armies, interpret dreams, or placate the spirits of the ancestors. Seondeok responded by interpreting dreams, placating ancestors, and when necessary, arming monks with swords and poetic metaphors. She ascended the throne in 632, and immediately, the heavens had things to say about it. Shortly after her coronation, a star reportedly fell from the sky, a meteor blazing over Silla's capital like a divine side-eye. Her enemies, never ones to miss a sign, took it as an omen of disaster. Seondeok took it as a challenge. She ordered the construction of Cheomseongdae, the oldest existing astronomical observatory in East Asia. It wasn't just for stargazing, it was a flex. A stone cylinder built from 362 granite blocks, one for each day of the lunar year, standing like a middle finger pointed straight at heaven and every conservative minister nearby. But she didn't stop there. Seondeok governed through a mix of Confucian hierarchy, Buddhist spirituality, and royal intuition. She funded temples. She distributed grain during famines. She quelled revolts, not with brute force, but with strategic marriages and a talent for outthinking anyone who brought a sword to a poetry fight. She even predicted a famine based on the blooming pattern of peonies in her garden, because of course she did. Now, about those husbands. Historical records are cagey. Some accounts suggest Seondeok never married. Others whisper about consorts, multiple consorts, in fact, none of whom held formal titles, all of whom played varying political or personal roles. There's talk of Kim Yongchun, a nobleman whose name appears beside hers in early records, possibly a romantic figure. There's mention of Yulyi, a military strategist and counselor who never officially claimed her hand but always seemed to be nearby when enemies disappeared. The truth? It depends on which chronicle you read and how much you believe men from the 7th century were willing to admit they answered to a woman. But what is clear is this: Seondeok ruled alone, with or without a husband, no king consort, no co-ruler, no man to soften the title, Queen Regnant. And that scared people. Her enemies, mostly male aristocrats with delusions of grandeur and no understanding of subtlety, plotted against her. In 647, one such noble Bidam led a full-scale rebellion under the charming slogan, "Women cannot rule the country." Bold? Considering Seondeok had already been doing exactly that for 15 years. She died shortly before the rebellion was fully crushed, but her legacy outlived her. The rebellion failed. Her successor, another woman, Queen Seondeok, took the throne after her, continuing the dynasty's stability and proving that yes, actually, women could rule the country, especially when the men kept screwing it up. Seondeok's reign didn't just set a precedent, it rewrote Scylla's expectations. She ruled during one of the kingdom's most turbulent decades, surrounded by war, internal division, and celestial threats, and still managed to govern with intelligence, calm, and a flair for the dramatic. She was called a philosopher queen, a divine mother, a trickster in royal robes. And if her rule was defined by prophecy, the next queen would flip that script. Because Queen Jinseong didn't just govern with omens, she governed despite them. Her reign was messy, uncertain, and marked by whispers of incest and betrayal. She married her uncle. She ruled an empire in decline. And she did it all with the solemn expression of someone who knew exactly how the story ended because she'd read it in a scroll and decided to write her own ending anyway. Queen Jinseong of Scylla. If Queen Seondeok lit the royal path for women in Scylla with starlight and prophecy, Queen Jinseong followed it barefoot, bloodstained, and politically exhausted. She was the third and final reigning queen of Scylla, and if her reign reads like a melancholic epilogue to her predecessor's brilliance, it's because it was. She inherited not just a crown, but a crumbling kingdom, a divided aristocracy, and a population who had grown suspicious of both monarchs and metaphysics. Her solution? Marry her uncle. Naturally. Let's begin where all respectable scandals begin. Family. Jinseong was born as Kim Man, the daughter of King Gyeongman and a royal consort. That alone placed her squarely in the highest echelons of Scylla nobility, noble enough to be considered for power, but peripheral enough to be considered disposable. By the time she reached adulthood, she had seen firsthand the kind of slow rot that sets in when kings chase temple patronage instead of taxation reform. Scylla was no longer the military juggernaut it once was. The borders had frayed, the nobles had stopped pretending to obey, and the peasants, those poetic, tragically overtaxed masses, were very close to lighting torches and asking difficult questions. Her brother, Honggung, reigned before her, and when he died without a male heir in 875, the royal court found itself in a classic dynastic panic. Who now? Another prince? A cousin? A nobleman with enough gold and a fake genealogy? Number. They turned to Jinseong. Not because they believed in her, but because they believed she'd be easy to control. Surprise. She accepted the throne. She wasn't young. She wasn't glamorous. And she wasn't anyone's fantasy of divine female rulership. She was, instead, pragmatic, bitterly aware of her kingdom's decay, and perhaps, just perhaps tired of watching men ruin things. Now, about that marriage. According to some sources, Jinseong married her paternal uncle, Kim Wi-hong. Let that sink in. She was now queen, and her husband was also her father's brother. This wasn't unprecedented. The royal family of Scylla had been playing genetic hopscotch for generations, blending politics, lineage, and mild nausea into a marriage strategy that defied logic. It kept the royal bloodline pure while turning the family tree into a tangled mess of duplicated names and questionable choices. Whether it was love, duty, or the political equivalent of fine, I guess. Jinseong's marriage to Chieu Hoang was less about romance and more about consolidating power. She needed someone who wouldn't challenge her authority outright but could still command the old noble family's attention. Chieu Hoang was a compromise, palatable, blood-bound, and unlikely to organize a coup as long as dinner was served on time. But the kingdom, alas, was less cooperative. Under Jinseong's reign, Scylla continued its long, slow descent into internal chaos. Rebellions became more frequent. Provincial governors stopped sending taxes. The military structure, once the pride of the kingdom, now resembled a ceremonial guard with no ceremonial purpose. Even the once sacred bone rank system, which dictated aristocratic privilege by birth and ancestry, was breaking down under the weight of bribes, grudges, and sheer exhaustion. Jinseong tried to hold it together. She continued the state patronage of Buddhism, hoping that piety might pacify unrest. She attempted reforms. She appointed relatives to key posts, not out of nepotism, but because loyalty had become a luxury she couldn't afford to waste on strangers. Still, nothing worked. The people muttered. The nobles conspired. The court grew brittle with fear. Her enemies called her weak, passive, unfit to rule. But what they really meant was that she hadn't performed a miracle. And by 887, after 12 years of ruling a ship already halfway sunk, Jinseong abdicated, voluntarily. She handed the crown to her cousin Hyeogong, an uninspiring man who would do little to stop the kingdom's slide into irrelevance. Jinseong, now stripped of her titles, retreated from politics. She didn't die in a blaze of glory or at the hands of a usurper. She just walked away. History, being both sexist and sentimental, tried to erase her. Chronicles painted her as soft, indecisive, overawed by her ministers. They whispered about her marriage, her childlessness, her lack of feminine virtue, as if ruling a dying kingdom while married to your uncle was just some kind of lifestyle choice. But here's what they don't say. Jinseong held it together longer than any of her advisors thought possible. She didn't plunge Scylla into chaos. She inherited it in shreds and did what she could. She was the last queen regnant of Scylla, the last in a remarkable line of female monarchs who had once ruled a Korean kingdom with spiritual force and poetic flair. And while she didn't leave behind great architecture or decisive battles, she left behind something quieter, an acknowledgement that endurance is its own kind of power. And so we close our procession of queens not with a bang, but with a whisper. Because sometimes the most mysterious queens are the ones whose stories aren't found in dusty chronicles, but in the spaces between the headlines, the royal photos, and the moments they weren't supposed to be seen.